The Omnibenevolence Conflict refers to the philosophical and theological struggle centered around the concept of omnibenevolence, a term that describes the attribute of being all good or possessing perfect goodness. This concept is most commonly associated with God, particularly in monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The conflict arises from the apparent contradiction between God's omnibenevolence and the presence of evil, suffering, and moral imperfection in the world. This tension is not only a central issue in the philosophy of religion, but also a deeply emotional and existential problem for individuals trying to reconcile the idea of a perfectly good deity with the harsh realities of life. At the heart of the omnibenevolence conflict is the question, how can an all-good, all-powerful God allow evil and suffering to exist? This question, often referred to as the problem of evil, has been a subject of intense debate for centuries. The conflict challenges the coherence of God's omnibenevolence and omnipotence, all-powerful nature, with implications for how people understand morality, justice, and divine purpose. The problem of evil can be broken down into two primary forms, the logical problem and the evidential problem. The logical problem of evil arises from the apparent contradiction between the existence of evil and the traditional understanding of an omnibenevolent and omnipotent God. The logic behind the problem is simple. If God is omnibenevolent, he would desire to eliminate evil. If God is omnipotent, he would be able to eliminate evil. Yet, evil exists. Therefore, how can God be both omnibenevolent and omnipotent if evil exists in the world? One of the classic arguments in this tradition was made by the philosopher Epicurus, who famously posed the dilemma, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? The evidential problem of evil is less concerned with logical contradiction and more focused on the abundance and severity of evil in the world. It argues that the sheer amount and intensity of suffering and evil in the world makes it improbable that an omnibenevolent and omnipotent God exists. The existence of gratuitous suffering, such as the suffering of innocent children or natural disasters, seems incompatible with the notion of a perfectly good and all-powerful deity. Over time, various theodicies, defenses of God's goodness in the face of evil, have been proposed by theologians and philosophers to address the omnibenevolence conflict. These theodicies generally attempt to reconcile the existence of a perfectly good God with the presence of evil in the world. One of the most well-known theodicies is the free will defense, which was notably championed by philosopher Alvin Plantinga. The idea is that God gave human beings free will, and that evil and suffering are a result of the misuse of that free will. According to this view, a world with free will is better than one without it, even though it entails the possibility of evil. In this framework, God cannot guarantee that free creatures will always choose good, as this would undermine their freedom. Thus, God's omnibenevolence is not at odds with the existence of evil, because free will is seen as a greater good than a world in which creatures are programmed to always do good. Critics of the free will defense point out that it does not account for natural evil, such as earthquakes, diseases, or natural disasters, which seems unrelated to human free will. If God is omnibenevolent, why would he allow such suffering to occur if it is not a consequence of human actions? Another popular theodicy is the soul-making argument, first articulated by philosopher John Hick. This view suggests that God allows evil and suffering because they serve a greater purpose, the development of virtues like courage, compassion, and resilience. According to this perspective, life's challenges and sufferings contribute to the growth of the soul, allowing humans to become morally and spiritually better beings. This process of soul-making is seen as a necessary condition for achieving a higher state of moral and spiritual excellence, which could not be attained in a world devoid of hardship or evil. Critics of this theodicy argue that it seems overly optimistic, and that the immense suffering experienced by some individuals cannot be justified by any ultimate purpose or the possibility of soul-making. They question whether certain instances of extreme suffering, such as genocide or the suffering of young children, could truly contribute to soul-making. Some theists argue that the existence of evil is necessary for the achievement of a greater good that would not otherwise be possible. For example, suffering may be required for the ultimate realization of a good that outweighs the evil in the world. This defense is closely related to the notion that God allows evil as part of a divine plan that is ultimately incomprehensible to human beings, but which will lead to a greater good in the end. This defense faces significant challenges, especially in terms of its plausibility. It can be hard for people to accept that the kinds of evils and suffering they witness could be part of some greater divine plan, particularly when it involves things like innocent suffering, natural disasters, or heinous acts of violence. In modern philosophy and theology, the omnibenevolence conflict continues to be a pivotal topic of discussion. Some contemporary thinkers argue that God's omnibenevolence is not a matter of eliminating all suffering, but rather a commitment to working through the suffering that exists in the world. They may propose that God's love is manifested not in preventing evil, but in helping to redeem or transform it, by offering comfort, guidance, and hope to those suffering. The issue of God's omnibenevolence is also closely tied to the problem of divine hiddenness. This is the question of why a perfectly good God does not make His presence and love more evident to human beings, thereby preventing much of the doubt, confusion, and suffering that people experience in their spiritual journeys. In addition to philosophical and theological discussions, the omnibenevolence conflict also plays a role in the lives of individuals. For many people, the experience of personal suffering, the loss of loved ones, or encountering the suffering of others can raise doubts about the nature of God. In times of crisis, the question of God's goodness is deeply felt and often leads to a reevaluation of religious beliefs. Some may abandon their faith, while others may turn to a deeper understanding of divine providence and mystery. The omnibenevolence conflict represents one of the most profound and enduring challenges in philosophy and theology. It forces individuals and thinkers to grapple with questions about the nature of God, the existence of evil, and the meaning of human suffering. While theodicies and defenses have been proposed to reconcile the existence of a good and powerful God with the presence of evil, the debate remains far from resolved. The tension between divine omnibenevolence and the reality of evil continues to shape religious and philosophical discourse, pushing people to think deeply about morality, justice, and the nature of existence itself. In the end, the omnibenevolence conflict serves as a reminder of the complexities inherent in understanding the divine and the human condition. The decision-making loop is a concept used to describe the ongoing cyclical process individuals and organizations go through when making decisions. It emphasizes the dynamic and often repetitive nature of decision-making, where decisions are influenced by feedback, new information, and evolving circumstances. This loop is not a one-time event, but rather a continuous cycle that requires constant evaluation, adaptation, and re-evaluation of choices. Understanding the decision-making loop can help improve the quality of decisions, enhance problem-solving, and foster more effective strategic planning. At the core of the decision-making loop is the idea that decisions do not occur in isolation. Instead, they are part of a feedback process where each choice made influences future decisions. When making a decision, individuals or groups evaluate available options, weigh potential outcomes, and choose a course of action. Once a decision is made, the effects of that choice are observed, and the feedback generated is used to inform subsequent decisions. This iterative process means that decision-making is a learning experience, where past choices help shape future ones. The decision-making loop can be understood as consisting of several key stages. The first stage is problem identification, where the decision-maker recognizes a challenge or opportunity that requires a choice. This stage often involves gathering information and assessing the situation to understand the nature of the problem. The next stage is the formulation of potential solutions or options. In this phase, individuals or groups generate possible courses of action and consider the advantages and disadvantages of each option. After the options have been considered, the decision-maker moves to the selection stage, where they choose the best course of action based on the available information and desired outcomes. Once the decision has been made, it is implemented, and the chosen solution is put into practice. However, this is not the end of the loop. Once the decision is executed, the effects of the action are monitored, and feedback is collected. This feedback provides valuable information about the decision's effectiveness and its consequences, which are then used to refine the decision-making process for the next round. One of the most important aspects of the decision-making loop is the feedback stage. Feedback allows decision-makers to assess whether their choices were effective or whether adjustments are needed. It provides information about the success or failure of a decision and helps identify areas where improvement can be made. Feedback can come from various sources, including data, observations, and input from others. The feedback loop ensures that decision-making is a responsive and adaptive process, where past experiences influence future decisions. The iterative nature of the decision-making loop also means that decisions are often revisited and revised over time. As new information becomes available or circumstances change, the decision-maker may return to previous stages of the loop and adjust their course of action. This process is particularly important in environments that are fast-paced or uncertain, where decisions need to be constantly adjusted to remain effective. The loop allows for flexibility and adaptability, ensuring that decisions remain relevant in the face of changing conditions. The decision-making loop is not just a linear process, it is also highly interconnected. The stages of the loop are interdependent, with each step influencing the others. For example, the feedback collected after implementing a decision may lead to a re-evaluation of the initial problem identification stage. In turn, the redefined problem may result in the consideration of new options or solutions. This interconnectedness creates a continuous flow of information, allowing decision-makers to refine their approach and improve the quality of their choices over time. In addition to individual decision-making, the decision-making loop is also applicable to organizational decision-making. Organizations often operate in complex, dynamic environments where multiple decisions must be made simultaneously or in coordination with one another. In such cases, the decision-making loop helps organizations remain responsive to changing conditions, adapt to new information, and align decisions with overall goals. Organizations that embrace the decision-making loop are better equipped to navigate uncertainty, manage risks, and optimize outcomes. There are several factors that can influence the effectiveness of the decision-making loop. One key factor is the quality and availability of information. Incomplete or inaccurate information can lead to poor decisions, which can affect the entire loop. Decision-makers must be able to gather and assess relevant data to make informed choices. Additionally, the decision-making process is often influenced by cognitive biases, emotions, and external pressures. These factors can distort the decision-making process and lead to suboptimal outcomes. By being aware of these influences, decision-makers can take steps to mitigate their impact and make more objective, rational decisions. Another important aspect of the decision-making loop is the role of collaboration and communication. In many cases, decisions are made by groups rather than individuals. Group decision-making introduces additional complexity, as it involves multiple perspectives, interests, and potential conflicts. Effective collaboration and communication are essential to ensure that all voices are heard, that decisions are made collectively, and that feedback is shared transparently. Group dynamics, such as power imbalances and groupthink, can also affect the quality of decisions. It is important to foster an environment of trust and open dialogue to support effective decision-making in groups. The concept of the decision-making loop also highlights the importance of time. In some situations, decisions need to be made quickly, while in others, there may be more time for careful consideration. The speed at which decisions are made can affect the quality of the loop, as rapid decisions may be based on incomplete information or insufficient feedback. Conversely, prolonged decision-making can lead to missed opportunities or indecisiveness. Striking the right balance between speed and thoroughness is a critical aspect of the decision-making loop. In the context of personal decision-making, the decision-making loop can help individuals make better choices by encouraging reflection, learning from past decisions, and adjusting behavior over time. For instance, when making career decisions, individuals can use the loop to assess their goals, evaluate potential paths, and monitor the outcomes of their choices. By continuously refining their decision-making process, they can improve their ability to navigate uncertainty and make choices that align with their values and aspirations. The decision-making loop is also relevant in the context of technology and artificial intelligence. In fields like machine learning, algorithms are designed to make decisions based on data and feedback, often through a loop of iterative learning. Just as humans engage in a decision-making loop, machines can be programmed to learn from their decisions, improving their performance over time. This iterative process is at the heart of advancements in artificial intelligence, where systems are constantly evolving and optimizing based on past experiences. In conclusion, the decision-making loop is a powerful framework for understanding the iterative, adaptive nature of decision-making. Whether applied to individuals or organizations, it emphasizes the need for continuous learning, feedback, and adjustment in the decision-making process. By recognizing the cyclical nature of decisions and the importance of feedback, decision-makers can improve the quality of their choices, enhance problem-solving, and navigate complex situations more effectively. The decision-making loop is not just a theoretical concept, but a practical tool for better decision-making in an ever-changing world. The problem of induction refers to a fundamental challenge in the philosophy of science that questions the justification for making inferences about the future or unobserved instances based on past observations. Inductive reasoning involves drawing general conclusions from specific observations or experiences. For example, observing that the sun rises every day in the past leads to the general conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow. While inductive reasoning is widely used in everyday life and scientific practice, the problem arises when one attempts to justify the reliability of inductive inferences. The issue stems from the fact that no matter how many instances of a phenomenon have been observed, there is no guarantee that future instances will align with the past ones. At the heart of the problem of induction is the idea that inductive reasoning, while practical and often successful, lacks a logical foundation. The central question is, how can we justify inductive inferences? In other words, why should we assume that the future will resemble the past, or that unobserved instances will follow the same patterns as those we have already witnessed? This problem has been a topic of philosophical debate for centuries and was famously discussed by the philosopher David Hume in the 18th century. Hume argued that there is no rational basis for believing that the future will resemble the past. He pointed out that inductive reasoning is based on the assumption that the future will be like the past, but this assumption itself cannot be justified through inductive reasoning, because it relies on the very reasoning it aims to justify. In other words, the justification for inductive inferences must itself be inductive, leading to a circular argument. Hume's skepticism about induction suggested that we cannot rationally justify our belief in the uniformity of nature, or the principle that future events will mirror past experiences. One of the key elements of the problem of induction is the idea of uniformity of nature. This is the assumption that the laws of nature are consistent, and that the future will unfold according to the same principles observed in the past. For example, we assume that the laws of physics that govern the movement of objects will continue to apply in the future. However, Hume argued that we have no logical reason to believe that nature will always behave uniformly. The fact that the sun has risen every day in the past does not logically guarantee that it will rise again tomorrow. In Hume's view, inductive reasoning is not grounded in any solid rational foundation, but rather in habit or custom. We come to expect future events to resemble past ones because of our psychological conditioning, not because of any logical justification. The problem of induction also raises important questions about the nature of knowledge and the limits of human reasoning. If inductive inferences cannot be justified rationally, this casts doubt on much of the knowledge we take for granted. Scientific theories, for example, are often based on inductive reasoning, where general laws are derived from repeated observations. If induction is unreliable, then how can we trust scientific conclusions about the world? This leads to a tension between the practical success of inductive reasoning and the lack of a theoretical justification for it. In response to Hume's skepticism, some philosophers have proposed solutions to the problem of induction. One of the most prominent responses comes from the philosopher Karl Popper, who rejected the idea that scientific theories are ever conclusively proven through induction. Instead, Popper argued that scientific knowledge progresses through a process of falsification. According to Popper, scientific theories are never definitively confirmed by inductive reasoning. Rather, they are subject to testing and can be falsified by counterexamples. In this view, science advances not by confirming hypotheses but by refuting them, which avoids the problem of induction by focusing on the empirical testing of theories rather than generalizing from past observations. Another approach to the problem of induction is the idea of probabilistic reasoning. Some philosophers argue that while inductive reasoning may not guarantee certainty, it can still provide reasonable probabilities based on past experience. For example, if a phenomenon has been observed consistently in the past, it is rational to expect it to occur again in the future, though with some degree of uncertainty. In this sense, induction can be viewed as a tool for making probable predictions rather than certain conclusions. This approach acknowledges the limitations of inductive reasoning, while still allowing for practical decision-making and scientific inquiry. In addition to these philosophical responses, some thinkers have embraced a more pragmatic approach, emphasizing the practical success of induction. While induction may not be logically justified, its consistent success in predicting future events and explaining natural phenomena suggests that it is a reliable method for navigating the world. From this perspective, the problem of induction may be seen as more of a theoretical concern than a practical one. In everyday life and scientific research, induction works well enough to guide actions and make predictions, even if it cannot be fully justified on a purely logical or philosophical basis. The problem of induction also has implications for the way we think about scientific theories and models. While scientific theories are often based on inductive reasoning, they are also subject to revision as new data becomes available. This means that scientific knowledge is not fixed, but rather evolving and tentative. The recognition of the limitations of inductive reasoning has led to a more cautious and critical approach in science, where hypotheses are tested, refined, and sometimes discarded based on new evidence. This ongoing process of testing and revising theories in light of new data reflects an awareness of the uncertainty inherent in inductive reasoning. Another aspect of the problem of induction is the question of how to deal with inductive leap. This refers to the gap between past observations and future predictions. Even though we may have observed a pattern in the past, the future may deviate from this pattern, especially when new factors or variables come into play. The inductive leap occurs when we extrapolate from past experiences to make predictions about future events, even though we can never be certain that these predictions will hold true. The inductive leap highlights the inherent uncertainty in inductive reasoning and underscores the difficulty of justifying generalizations based on finite experiences. Despite these challenges, the problem of induction remains a central issue in the philosophy of science and epistemology. It challenges our understanding of knowledge and the reliability of our reasoning processes. While there may be no perfect solution to the problem, it continues to provoke thought and discussion about the limits of human knowledge and the nature of scientific inquiry. The problem invites us to reflect on the assumptions underlying our everyday reasoning, as well as the methods we use to draw conclusions about the world. In conclusion, the problem of induction is a deep philosophical challenge that raises questions about the justification of inductive reasoning, the uniformity of nature, and the reliability of scientific knowledge. While philosophers like Hume have cast doubt on the rational basis for induction, various responses and approaches have been proposed, including falsificationism, probabilistic reasoning, and pragmatism. The issue remains unresolved in many ways, but it continues to influence discussions on knowledge, science, and the limits of human reasoning. The problem of induction serves as a reminder of the complexities inherent in our attempts to understand the world and make informed decisions based on past experience. The paradox of identity refers to a philosophical puzzle that challenges our understanding of identity over time. The paradox highlights questions about how an object or entity can remain the same through changes, and what it means for something to retain its identity over time, especially when it undergoes transformations. The issue of identity has been a central concern in metaphysics, as it deals with the fundamental nature of being, persistence, and change. The paradox of identity seeks to explore these concepts in relation to how things persist through time and what conditions are necessary for something to maintain its identity. One of the central questions of the paradox of identity is how an object can be the same object at different times, even if it changes in various ways. This question can be illustrated through various thought experiments. A well-known example of the paradox is the ship of Theseus thought experiment, which asks whether a ship that has had all its parts replaced remains the same ship. If every component of the ship is gradually replaced with a new part, at what point, if any, does the ship cease to be the ship of Theseus and become something else entirely? This question forces us to think about what it means for an object to maintain its identity through change. The ship of Theseus paradox illustrates the tension between two different intuitions about identity: the idea of numerical identity, the notion that an object is the same object over time despite changes, and the idea of qualitative identity, the notion that identity is defined by the characteristics an object possesses. If the ship has undergone complete replacement of its parts, is it still the same ship, or is it a completely new object? Some argue that if the ship retains the same function, structure, and overall appearance, it can be considered the same ship. Others maintain that identity depends on the persistence of its original material, and thus the replacement of its components means that it is no longer the ship of Theseus. The ship of Theseus paradox introduces a more general issue in philosophy known as the problem of persistence through change. This issue asks how an object can continue to exist through time while undergoing change, as objects often do. Over time, objects inevitably change in terms of their physical components, their properties, or their states. Yet, we still consider them to be the same object. The paradox forces us to confront the problem of whether an object can remain identical to itself despite these changes, and if so, under what conditions this can be true. A related aspect of the paradox of identity is the question of spatial and temporal continuity. How do we define the identity of an object that occupies different locations in space or exists at different times? For instance, when a person moves from one place to another or experiences aging, is that person still the same person, or is the identity of the person continually shifting? This issue relates to the broader problem of how entities persist over time, despite experiencing changes in location, form, or state. The paradox of identity also raises questions about what constitutes an essential property of an object. What is it that makes an object the specific thing it is, and how can we determine which features are essential to its identity, and which are merely accidental? In the ship of Theseus example, one could argue that the identity of the ship is tied to certain essential properties, such as its structure, function, or purpose, rather than to its individual parts. In this case, the ship's identity persists as long as it continues to fulfill its intended function, regardless of changes to its components. Alternatively, some philosophers have proposed that identity requires continuity in material composition. According to this view, if an object's original material is replaced, the object ceases to exist as the same entity, even if its form and function remain the same. This view aligns with the idea that the persistence of an object's identity is tied to the persistence of its material substance. The paradox of identity is also connected to the idea of personal identity. Philosophers have long debated what it means for a person to remain the same person over time, despite the inevitable physical and psychological changes they undergo. For example, a person's body undergoes continual changes, such as the replacement of cells, aging, and the possibility of injury or illness. Furthermore, a person's mind may change as they acquire new experiences, memories, and knowledge. Despite these changes, we typically continue to regard the same person as being the same individual. The problem of personal identity touches on questions such as whether identity is rooted in the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of the physical body, or the continuity of psychological traits like memory and personality. For instance, philosopher John Locke argued that personal identity is tied to the continuity of consciousness. A person remains the same person as long as they maintain the same self-awareness and memory of past experiences, even if their physical body changes. According to this view, a person who loses their memories or experiences a dramatic change in consciousness might no longer be the same person. In contrast, some philosophers argue that personal identity is tied more closely to the physical continuity of the body. According to this view, as long as the same physical body continues to exist, the person remains the same individual, regardless of changes in memory or consciousness. This debate about personal identity is crucial for understanding how identity functions over time, particularly as we navigate the complexities of aging, memory loss, and physical changes. The paradox of identity also gives rise to the issue of numerical identity versus qualitative identity. Numerical identity refers to the concept that an object is one and the same thing over time, even if it undergoes changes in its properties or parts. Qualitative identity, on the other hand, refers to the idea that two objects can be considered identical if they share all the same properties. The problem of identity over time often involves distinguishing between these two concepts and determining whether identity can be maintained through changes in qualities or whether it is only preserved if the object remains numerically the same. One potential solution to the paradox is the concept of time slice theory, which suggests that identity is tied to specific slices of time. According to this view, a person or object is made up of a series of distinct moments, and identity is determined by the relationship between those moments. This theory implies that identity is a process of continuity rather than a fixed state, and it allows for change over time while preserving identity. Another solution is the four-dimensionalist approach, which posits that objects and persons are extended in time as well as space, existing as a series of temporal parts or time slices. This view suggests that an object's identity can be understood as a collection of all its temporal parts, each of which contributes to its overall identity. This approach provides a way of understanding persistence through change by seeing identity as a dynamic and extended phenomenon. In conclusion, the paradox of identity raises profound questions about the nature of identity, persistence, and change. It challenges our understanding of how objects and persons maintain their identity over time, despite undergoing various transformations. The paradox has led to numerous philosophical discussions and debates, with solutions ranging from theories of continuity and material composition to theories of personal identity based on consciousness and memory. The paradox of identity continues to be a central issue in metaphysics, prompting philosophers to explore the fundamental nature of identity and the conditions under which something can remain the same through time. Quantum suicide is a thought experiment based on the principles of quantum mechanics, specifically the many worlds interpretation, which explores the implications of quantum theory on concepts of life, death, and personal survival. The thought experiment is a variation of the Schrödinger's cat paradox, designed to examine the subjective experience of death in the context of quantum mechanics and the idea of parallel universes. Quantum suicide raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the multiverse, and the relationship between quantum physics and subjective reality. The basic premise of quantum suicide involves a hypothetical situation where a person is subjected to a quantum event with a life or death outcome. To illustrate this, imagine a person is placed in a setup similar to Schrödinger's cat experiment, where a quantum event determines whether a lethal outcome will occur. The key idea behind quantum suicide is that the outcome of this event is probabilistic, meaning that there is a chance the person will survive and a chance they will die, depending on the collapse of the quantum wave function. In the many worlds interpretation, however, this collapse does not occur in the traditional sense. Instead, it gives rise to multiple parallel realities where every possible outcome of a quantum event occurs in a separate, branching universe. In this scenario, the individual would experience survival in one branch of the universe while dying in another, creating a series of parallel worlds in which different outcomes are realized. The thought experiment suggests that, from the subjective perspective of the individual undergoing the experiment, the possibility of death would never be realized, as they would always find themselves in the branch of reality where they survive. According to this interpretation, the individual would never experience their own death because they would continue to jump into the surviving branch of the multiverse. In essence, the person is assumed to survive in every instance where the quantum event occurs, even though, in other branches of the multiverse, they have died. The idea behind quantum suicide raises questions about the nature of personal experience and whether consciousness is inherently tied to the specific universe one occupies. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, each quantum event leads to the branching of the universe into multiple parallel worlds, each one representing a different outcome. In one branch, the individual might survive, while in another, they might die. However, according to the thought experiment, the individual would only ever experience the branch in which they continue to survive, which raises the issue of whether consciousness can exist across multiple universes or if it is confined to a single branch of reality. The concept of quantum suicide also explores the potential implications for the idea of subjective immortality. The thought experiment seems to suggest that, in the many worlds framework, individuals may experience a form of immortality in which they never experience death, as they continue to survive in the branches of reality where they do not die. This idea ties into the broader philosophical debate about the nature of death and consciousness. If death is the end of subjective experience, then, according to quantum suicide, one could argue that death is not a real event for the individual, because they are continuously shifting into branches where they survive. This presents an intriguing paradox. While the person would technically die in some universes, their subjective experience would never include death. This idea challenges the conventional understanding of death as a universal and inevitable event. In the context of quantum suicide, the idea of death becomes less of a singular event and more of a probabilistic outcome, experienced only in parallel worlds that the individual does not perceive. The thought experiment poses the question: can death truly be understood in a meaningful way if the person never experiences it directly? This also raises the problem of what it means to survive in the context of quantum mechanics, as survival in one branch does not necessarily imply survival in all branches. The fact that an individual would not experience their own death does not mean they are immortal in the traditional sense, but instead highlights the role of consciousness in determining the experience of life and death. Quantum suicide also raises important questions about the ethical and philosophical implications of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. While the many worlds interpretation provides a coherent framework for understanding the branching of the universe, it has significant implications for the nature of personal identity and the meaning of life and death. If every possible outcome of a quantum event results in the creation of a new branch of reality, then the concept of personal identity becomes more complicated. In each branch, a version of the individual exists, but the experiences and decisions made by those versions diverge. Does this mean that the original person ceases to exist once they are split into multiple versions of themselves across parallel universes? And if each version of the individual is conscious of their own survival, what does this imply for the continuity of identity across worlds? The concept of quantum suicide also leads to a philosophical discussion of anthropic reasoning, the idea that the universe must be in a certain way in order for conscious observers to exist within it. In the case of quantum suicide, the thought experiment hinges on the idea that an individual would continue to exist in the branches of reality where they survive. This could be seen as a form of anthropic reasoning. The universe must branch in such a way that the observer always experiences survival, because, from the observer's point of view, death is never a possibility. This raises the question of whether the multiverse concept is inherently anthropocentric, and whether it implies that subjective experiences are somehow privileged or protected within the framework of quantum mechanics. One of the key criticisms of the quantum suicide thought experiment is its reliance on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The many worlds theory, although an elegant and mathematically consistent explanation of quantum phenomena, is still highly debated in the scientific community. Some physicists argue that the many worlds interpretation is unnecessary and overly complex, while others maintain that it offers the most coherent way of explaining quantum events. The debate over the many worlds interpretation affects the philosophical implications of quantum suicide, as the thought experiment assumes the validity of a multiverse, where all possible outcomes are realized in separate branches. Additionally, quantum suicide has been criticized for its reliance on the concept of subjective experience. Critics argue that even if the many worlds interpretation is correct, and the observer survives in one branch of the multiverse, the experience of death is still an inherent part of reality. While it may be true that the observer does not experience their own death in the same way that an outside observer would, it remains unclear whether this represents a form of immortality or merely an illusion of continuity. Despite these criticisms, quantum suicide remains an intriguing thought experiment because it pushes the boundaries of our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of reality. It highlights the tensions between the scientific and philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, particularly in relation to concepts of survival, death, and the multiverse. The thought experiment forces us to reconsider traditional notions of personal identity and subjective experience in light of the quantum nature of the universe, and invites us to explore new ways of thinking about the relationship between physics, consciousness, and the ultimate fate of the individual. In conclusion, quantum suicide is a thought experiment that uses the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics to explore profound questions about life, death, and identity. By considering a scenario in which a person undergoes a quantum event with life or death consequences, the thought experiment challenges our understanding of survival, immortality, and the nature of subjective experience. While the thought experiment raises intriguing philosophical and scientific questions, it also underscores the complexity and uncertainty of understanding consciousness and personal identity in a universe governed by quantum mechanics. The Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome refers to a situation in which someone attempts to solve a problem or achieve a goal, only to inadvertently create an even larger problem due to their lack of control, understanding, or foresight. The term draws its inspiration from the famous tale The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was popularized by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's poem, and later adapted in various forms, including the Disney film Fantasia. In the story, an apprentice seeks to use magic to make his chores easier, but, lacking the wisdom to control the magic, ends up creating chaos and worsening the situation. In the context of the syndrome, the tale is a metaphor for the unintended consequences of attempting to apply a powerful tool, method, or technology without fully understanding how to control it. The apprentice in the story, who is not yet fully capable of handling the magical powers at his disposal, represents anyone who ventures into complex, unknown, or powerful areas without proper preparation or the requisite knowledge. The result is typically a runaway situation where an initial problem becomes much worse due to a lack of control, leading to greater difficulties than were initially present. The Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome is often discussed in the context of modern technological advancements, particularly with innovations that possess immense potential but can also be easily misused or lead to unforeseen consequences. For example, the rise of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or large-scale industrialization can all be seen through the lens of this syndrome. While these technologies may offer promising solutions or benefits, their uncontrolled or premature deployment can result in catastrophic side effects. As with the apprentice in the story, the desire to harness power without understanding the full scope of its consequences can lead to an out-of-control situation. A key aspect of the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome is the lack of foresight. In the story, the apprentice's lack of understanding of magic's limits leads him to act without thinking through the consequences of his actions. He orders the enchanted broom to fetch water, but when the broom keeps bringing more and more water, the apprentice is unable to stop it. This reflects how a lack of planning or insufficient understanding of a system can lead to an escalating problem. In real-world applications, this could manifest as an engineer or scientist implementing a new technology or system without anticipating potential negative impacts, such as environmental harm, economic disruption, or social inequality. The idea of lack of control is another critical component of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. In the story, the apprentice initially has control over the broom, but once the magic is set in motion, he finds himself powerless to stop it. This is emblematic of how, in the real world, humans can sometimes create systems or deploy technologies that quickly grow beyond their ability to manage. For example, large-scale social media platforms were created to enhance communication and connectivity, but the lack of regulation and oversight allowed them to spiral into environments of misinformation, privacy violations, and online harm. What started as a tool to help people has led to unintended consequences, with the creators now struggling to regain control of the system they built. The concept of escalation is another central theme in the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. As the apprentice's problem intensifies and more water floods the room, he desperately tries to fix it but only makes things worse. This mirrors situations where efforts to mitigate or correct an initial problem lead to even bigger issues. In environmental science, for example, the use of certain chemicals or industrial practices that were initially thought to be harmless has led to unexpected ecological disasters, such as the depletion of the ozone layer or the acceleration of climate change. The initial intention may have been to improve human life or solve a pressing issue, but the result has been the exacerbation of environmental damage. One modern example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome can be found in the field of biotechnology. Genetic modification and gene editing technologies like CRISPR hold enormous potential for advancing medicine, curing diseases, and improving food security. However, there are concerns that without proper regulation and understanding, such technologies could lead to unforeseen consequences, such as ecological imbalances or new forms of inequality. The creation of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, for instance, was initially hailed as a breakthrough in agriculture, but concerns over the long-term effects on biodiversity and food sovereignty have escalated. Similarly, the potential for gene editing technology to be used in controversial ways, such as designer babies or unintended mutations, highlights the importance of exercising caution and foresight when dealing with powerful technologies. The rise of artificial intelligence, AI, also exemplifies the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. AI has the potential to revolutionize industries, improve healthcare, and solve complex problems. However, without adequate control and regulation, AI can lead to unintended consequences such as job displacement, privacy breaches, and biased algorithms that perpetuate social inequality. The rapid development of autonomous systems such as self-driving cars or military drones raises questions about safety, accountability, and the limits of AI's decision-making capabilities. As with the apprentice's inability to stop the broom, AI systems may become increasingly difficult to control as they become more complex and integrated into society. The sorcerer's apprentice syndrome can also apply to economic policies and global systems. For example, the global financial crisis of 2008 serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked financial systems. The use of complex financial instruments, like mortgage-backed securities and derivatives, was initially seen as a way to spread risk and enhance economic growth. However, the lack of understanding and oversight of these products led to the collapse of major financial institutions and a worldwide recession. The problem grew out of control because the people responsible for creating these financial tools were not fully aware of the potential risks or the way their actions could trigger a global economic collapse. The rise of social media platforms also provides an example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. Originally designed to foster connection and communication, these platforms have evolved into powerful tools for shaping public opinion, spreading information and misinformation, and influencing political discourse. The unintended consequences include issues such as cyberbullying, privacy violations, and the spread of false or harmful information. Attempts to address these problems through stricter content moderation or algorithmic changes often lead to new challenges, such as censorship concerns, increased polarization, or further entrenchment of misinformation. Social media's creators, like the Apprentice, may find themselves struggling to control something that has grown too large and uncontrollable. The concept of the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome also highlights the need for responsibility in the development and deployment of powerful tools or systems. When undertaking any project, especially one involving technology, innovation, or complex systems, it is crucial to anticipate the potential consequences of actions, including the possibility that things may spiral out of control. The Apprentice's failure to understand the limits of magic is a lesson in humility, demonstrating that power, without knowledge and control, can quickly lead to chaos. As technologies continue to advance, it is essential that we apply rigorous ethical standards, anticipate potential risks, and take proactive steps to avoid creating problems that we may be unable to undo. In conclusion, the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of acting without fully understanding the systems we are dealing with. It underscores the importance of foresight, control, and responsibility in managing powerful technologies and complex systems. Whether it involves artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or financial systems, the failure to anticipate the consequences of our actions can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Like the Apprentice in the story, we may find ourselves overwhelmed by forces that we can no longer control, and the consequences of our well-intentioned actions can become far more damaging than the problems we sought to solve. The paradox of burden of proof is a philosophical and logical dilemma that arises when it comes to determining who is responsible for proving a claim or proposition. The burden of proof traditionally falls on the person making an assertion, requiring them to provide evidence or arguments to support their claim. However, the paradox occurs when the very determination of where the burden lies becomes unclear, leading to confusion and potential circular reasoning. This paradox plays a significant role in debates surrounding logic, philosophy of science, legal arguments, and even everyday discussions. At its core, the burden of proof refers to the obligation to provide evidence for one's claims. In a typical debate or argument, the burden of proof falls on the person who makes a positive assertion. For example, if someone claims aliens exist, it is generally accepted that the burden of proof lies with that person to provide evidence supporting the existence of aliens. This principle is rooted in the idea that the person making a claim must substantiate it, rather than forcing others to disprove it. The paradox emerges when the burden of proof becomes a point of contention in itself. In some cases, individuals may try to shift the burden of proof onto others, or argue that the lack of evidence for a claim constitutes evidence against it. For example, in a discussion about the existence of supernatural beings, one side may assert there is no evidence that these beings don't exist, and thus claim that their position is as valid as the one requiring evidence for their existence. This introduces a situation where the need for proof becomes ambiguous and difficult to assign clearly to one side or the other, often resulting in unproductive debates or arguments. One form of the paradox of burden of proof occurs when a claim is made but no evidence is offered, and the person making the claim demands that others disprove it. In the example of a supernatural claim, the person asserting the existence of ghosts or spirits might say, "I can't prove they exist, but you can't prove they don't exist, so my claim is as valid as yours." This line of reasoning attempts to place the burden of proof on the skeptic rather than on the person making the positive assertion, creating a logical paradox where the requirement to provide evidence becomes unclear. The paradox is often most problematic in discussions about null hypotheses and extraordinary claims. In scientific methodology, the null hypothesis is typically the default position that no effect or phenomenon exists unless sufficient evidence is provided to reject it. The paradox of burden of proof can arise in situations where extraordinary claims are made, such as the assertion of a new scientific theory or a claim about an unexplained phenomenon. The claim of extraordinary evidence being required for extraordinary claims, famously proposed by Carl Sagan, emphasizes that the burden of proof lies with the person making the extraordinary claim. However, the paradox of burden of proof arises when it is unclear what constitutes adequate evidence, or how extraordinary a claim must be to warrant a higher standard of proof. For example, if someone claims that they saw a UFO, the burden of proof is often placed on them to provide evidence to support the claim. However, the paradox arises when individuals argue that the burden of proof is on others to disprove the claim, creating a situation where the very concept of proof becomes ambiguous. In legal contexts, the paradox of burden of proof can similarly cause confusion. In most legal systems, the burden of proof is placed on the prosecution in criminal cases, meaning that they must prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the paradox arises when the defense claims that the prosecution has failed to meet this burden, and in doing so, shifts the focus to the defendant's innocence. In some cases, the defendant may argue that they do not need to prove their innocence, and instead, the prosecution must disprove their innocence. This creates a circular argument where both parties are attempting to shift the burden of proof, leading to uncertainty about who is actually required to provide evidence or justify their claims. The paradox of burden of proof is also relevant in discussions of skepticism and confirmation bias. Skeptics often argue that extraordinary claims should be met with extraordinary evidence, and they emphasize the need for rigorous evidence before accepting new ideas or theories. However, the paradox arises when skeptics insist on proof for all claims, but refuse to provide any evidence for their own claims or positions. In this situation, the skeptic may demand disproof from others while providing no justification for their own views, which leads to an imbalance in the conversation. The paradox can also be exacerbated by confirmation bias, where people selectively focus on evidence that supports their own beliefs while disregarding evidence that contradicts their position, making it difficult to determine who is actually responsible for providing proof. In addition to these practical implications, the paradox of burden of proof raises important philosophical questions about the nature of knowledge, belief, and justification. One question that arises is whether it is possible to truly prove or disprove a claim beyond a reasonable doubt. In many cases, proving a claim to be absolutely true or false may be impossible due to limitations in evidence or the complexity of the claim itself. This raises the issue of whether we should ever require absolute proof for any assertion, or whether we should focus on more reasonable standards of evidence that allow us to form beliefs based on the best available information. The paradox of burden of proof challenges the idea that proof is a binary concept, with claims either being fully proven or fully disproven. Instead, it suggests that proof may be a spectrum, where evidence plays a crucial role in determining the plausibility of a claim, but definitive proof may never be attainable. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about the role of assumptions in argumentation. Often, debates or arguments are framed in terms of evidence and proof, with one side arguing that the other must provide sufficient evidence to justify their claims. However, the paradox of burden of proof forces us to consider the assumptions that underlie our expectations of what constitutes valid evidence. For example, in debates about the existence of God or other metaphysical topics, participants may rely on assumptions about the nature of evidence itself, such as the requirement for empirical data or the need for direct observation. However, if these assumptions are challenged, the burden of proof may shift in ways that make it difficult to determine whose position is truly more justified. To navigate the paradox of burden of proof, it is essential to consider the standards of proof that apply to different contexts. In scientific inquiry, for instance, the burden of proof typically rests with those making positive claims, and the level of proof required depends on the nature of the claim being made. In legal contexts, the burden of proof is often subject to specific rules, such as the presumption of innocence in criminal trials. Similarly, in everyday discussions, the burden of proof can be understood as a shared responsibility to provide reasonable evidence for one's assertions. In all these cases, clarity about the burden of proof is necessary to ensure productive conversations and avoid endless disputes over who must provide the evidence. In conclusion, the paradox of burden of proof raises significant questions about the nature of evidence, justification, and the expectations we place on those making claims. The paradox occurs when the determination of who carries the burden of proof becomes unclear or ambiguous, leading to confusion, circular arguments, and unproductive debates. Whether in scientific, legal, or philosophical contexts, the paradox challenges our assumptions about proof and calls for greater clarity in discussions about knowledge, belief, and justification. The paradox underscores the importance of understanding the limits of evidence, the role of assumptions, and the need for reasonable standards of proof when evaluating claims. The island of truth-tellers and liars is a well-known logical puzzle or thought experiment that is commonly used to illustrate reasoning, truth, and deception in philosophy, logic, and problem-solving. The puzzle is set in a fictional scenario where a person or group finds themselves on an island populated by two distinct types of inhabitants: truth-tellers and liars. Truth-tellers always tell the truth, and liars always lie. The objective of this puzzle is to navigate the complex interactions between truth-tellers and liars in order to deduce correct information from seemingly contradictory statements. The setup typically involves an individual who encounters a series of questions or dilemmas involving the inhabitants of the island. These inhabitants may make statements, answer questions, or give directions, and the challenge is to determine who is a truth-teller and who is a liar based on these interactions. The fundamental question is often something like, what should I ask to determine whether a person is a truth-teller or a liar? The paradox and intrigue of this thought experiment arise from the consistent rule that the truth-tellers cannot lie and the liars cannot tell the truth. And yet the person trying to gather information must figure out the nature of these individuals using limited information. One way to approach the puzzle is by focusing on the nature of the statements that can be made. For example, if a truth-teller is asked a question, their answer will be truthful and reliable. However, if a liar is asked the same question, their answer will be intentionally false. The trick is that in some versions of the puzzle, the questioner may not know who is who at first, and each interaction must be carefully considered. A classic version of the puzzle presents a scenario where the individual asking questions is presented with two inhabitants. One is a truth-teller and the other a liar, but they don't know which is which. The person must ask a question that provides a reliable answer no matter who they ask, and this is where logical thinking becomes essential. A popular strategy in solving the island of truth-tellers and liars puzzle involves asking a question whose answer will be the same regardless of whether the individual is a truth-teller or a liar. The question typically used is something like, If I were to ask the other person whether you are a truth teller, what would they say? This question works because if the person being questioned is a truth teller, they will truthfully report the liar's response, which would be false. If the person being questioned is a liar, they will lie about the truth teller's answer, also resulting in a false response. In both cases, the response will be false, allowing the questioner to deduce that the person they asked is a liar. From there, they can identify the truth teller as the other person. The central feature of the island of truth tellers and liars puzzle is the interaction between truth and falsehood in a controlled environment, and how logical reasoning can help resolve ambiguity. By carefully considering the nature of the statements being made, it's possible to deduce who can be trusted and who cannot. The puzzle plays on the assumption that truth tellers are always reliable, while liars always deceive, which in turn highlights the difficulty of making decisions when faced with incomplete or contradictory information. The paradoxical nature of the puzzle arises when one tries to apply basic logic to situations where multiple variables and contradictory statements are involved. Since truth tellers always speak the truth and liars always lie, there can seem to be no way of finding a middle ground or establishing reliable information from conflicting answers. This creates an intriguing puzzle in which the rules of reasoning are tested. The questioner has to use careful analysis and logical deduction to isolate the truth from a sea of falsehoods. The importance of self-referential statements and paradoxical reasoning is also a key theme in the island of truth tellers and liars. This can be understood through the lens of logical paradoxes, which are statements that appear to contradict themselves and cannot easily be classified as true or false. For example, the liar paradox presents a scenario where someone says, "I am lying." If the statement is true, then they are lying, which makes the statement false. However, if the statement is false, then they are telling the truth, creating a contradiction. Similarly, in the island of truth tellers and liars puzzle, the person trying to solve the problem must navigate conflicting statements and determine the nature of truth and falsehood within a set of fixed rules. A major takeaway from the puzzle is the role of inference in logic. The puzzle emphasizes how a single question can be used to infer the truth, even when the information at hand is deceptive. For example, in the classic question, "If I were to ask the other person whether you are a truth teller, what would they say?" The answer hinges on the logic of contradiction. The answer is structured so that the questioner can infer the identity of the truth teller or liar through a process of logical elimination, regardless of the person they initially ask. This showcases how logic, combined with an understanding of deception, can help navigate seemingly complex situations. Another aspect of the puzzle is its potential for application in real-world problem-solving. While the island of truth tellers and liars may be a hypothetical scenario, the skills it teaches about deductive reasoning and critical thinking are widely applicable. For example, this thought experiment mirrors situations in life where conflicting information is presented, and one must carefully evaluate sources and statements to arrive at a correct conclusion. Whether navigating political debates, assessing the reliability of information sources, or solving everyday problems that involve competing interests or perspectives, the island of truth tellers and liars puzzle encourages a logical, systematic approach to decision-making. In a broader context, the puzzle also raises important philosophical questions about trust and certainty. The very nature of the problem, deciding who is truthful and who is deceptive, reflects the way we engage with truth in everyday life. How do we determine whom to trust when there are competing claims? What role does verification, evidence, and reason play in arriving at conclusions? The puzzle, by showing how truth and falsehood can be separated through careful reasoning, highlights the need for critical thinking in a world where deception is often present. Furthermore, the puzzle touches on the idea of moral choice and ethical judgment when dealing with deception. If truth-tellers always tell the truth and liars always lie, is one more morally justified than the other? The puzzle does not delve deeply into the ethical consequences of being a truth-teller or a liar, but it can prompt us to consider the moral dimensions of honesty and deceit. In real-life scenarios, the stakes may not be so neatly divided, and individuals may be compelled to balance honesty with other ethical considerations, such as compassion or self-preservation. The dilemma presented by the puzzle forces us to confront how we deal with conflicting truths in a complex world. In conclusion, the island of truth-tellers and liars serves as a powerful thought experiment that illustrates key concepts in logic, reasoning, and decision-making. The puzzle emphasizes how careful logical analysis and strategic questioning can help resolve contradictions and identify the truth in situations where deception is involved. By exploring themes of trust, inference, and paradox, the puzzle also touches on deeper philosophical questions about the nature of truth and how we navigate complex information. While the puzzle is abstract, the problem-solving skills it encourages are practical and applicable to real-world situations, making it an enduring and valuable tool for enhancing critical thinking. The Epimenides Paradox, also known as the liar paradox, is a classical logical paradox that originates from a statement made by Epimenides, a Greek philosopher from Crete. The paradox arises from the simple yet profound statement, "All Cretans are liars." This statement leads to a contradiction when examined closely, illustrating the complexities of self-reference, truth, and logic. The Epimenides Paradox has intrigued philosophers and logicians for centuries, as it challenges our understanding of language, truth, and reasoning. The paradox is self-referential in nature. Epimenides, being a Cretan himself, claims that all Cretans are liars. However, if his statement is true, then, as a Cretan, he must also be a liar. But if Epimenides is a liar, then his statement that all Cretans are liars would itself be false, which implies that not all Cretans are liars. This creates a logical contradiction. If the statement is true, then it must also be false, leading to a paradox where it is impossible to definitively classify the statement as either true or false. This paradox is an early example of what is now called a self-referential paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates logical inconsistencies. In this case, the statement creates a loop. If the statement is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. This paradox highlights the limitations of classical logic, where a statement must be either true or false, and exposes the challenges of dealing with statements that refer to themselves. The Epimenides paradox can be analyzed through the lens of truth theory and logical frameworks. In classical two-valued logic, a statement is either true or false, and there is no middle ground. However, the Epimenides paradox undermines this binary system. If Epimenides' statement is true, then it creates a situation where truth and falsehood are intertwined in a way that cannot be resolved within the classical framework. This paradox challenges the foundations of truth, as it suggests that there are cases where a statement cannot be classified as either true or false. One way to approach the Epimenides paradox is to consider it in terms of meta-linguistic analysis. In this context, the paradox arises because the statement, "all Cretans are liars," refers to a class of people, Cretans, and makes a claim about the truthfulness of all members of that class. However, the statement itself is made by a member of that class, leading to a situation where the truth of the statement is dependent on the truthfulness of the person making it. This creates a circular dependency, where the statement refers to itself, making it difficult to assign a clear truth value. The Epimenides Paradox also relates to paraconsistent logic, a branch of logic that allows for contradictions to exist without collapsing the entire logical system. In traditional logic, contradictions are not allowed because they lead to logical incoherence. However, paraconsistent logic permits contradictions to exist in a controlled manner, allowing for the possibility of statements that can be both true and false at the same time. The Epimenides Paradox can be understood within this framework, as it demonstrates a situation where classical logic breaks down and new logical systems may be required to account for self-referential contradictions. In addition to its significance in formal logic, the Epimenides Paradox also has philosophical implications. It raises important questions about the nature of truth and the limits of language. The paradox suggests that language itself can create situations where our understanding of truth becomes problematic. If a statement can be both true and false, then the very concept of truth may need to be reconsidered. This has led to discussions in philosophy of language about the nature of truth, reference, and meaning, and the ways in which self-referential statements can challenge our understanding of these concepts. The paradox also has implications for the theory of proof and justification. In logic, a proof is typically a sequence of statements that lead to a conclusion that is necessarily true. However, the Epimenides Paradox presents a situation where it is impossible to prove the truth of the statement in question. If the statement, "all Cretans are liars," is true, then it leads to a contradiction. But if it is false, it also leads to a contradiction. This suggests that some statements may be inherently unprovable, challenging the notion that every claim must be capable of being proven or disproven. In modern philosophy, the Epimenides Paradox has been explored in connection with logical foundations and formal systems. The paradox is often used as a starting point for discussions of more advanced logical theories, such as Russell's paradox, which similarly deals with self-referential sets and their implications for set theory. Russell's paradox arises when one considers the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. This set leads to a logical contradiction, similar to the one presented by the Epimenides Paradox. Both paradoxes demonstrate the need for more sophisticated logical systems that can account for self-reference and avoid the contradictions that arise in classical systems. The Epimenides Paradox also connects to discussions about circular reasoning and begging the question, which are common logical fallacies. Circular reasoning occurs when the conclusion of an argument is assumed within the premises, leading to a situation where the argument is not providing any new information or evidence. In the case of the Epimenides Paradox, the statement, "all Cretans are liars," is self-referential, and the truth of the statement depends on whether or not Epimenides himself is a liar, creating a circular dependency that undermines the ability to evaluate the statement in a straightforward manner. In a broader sense, the Epimenides Paradox is also relevant to epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge. The paradox challenges our ability to know whether certain statements are true or false, particularly when those statements refer to themselves. If a statement can be both true and false, it becomes difficult to determine what we actually know about the world. This raises important questions about the nature of knowledge and the limits of our understanding, especially when dealing with self-referential or paradoxical statements. In conclusion, the Epimenides Paradox is a profound and influential logical puzzle that has far-reaching implications for our understanding of truth, language, and logic. The paradox arises from the simple yet contradictory statement, "all Cretans are liars," which leads to a situation where the statement can be neither true nor false, highlighting the limitations of classical logic and the challenges of self-referential reasoning. The paradox has been explored in various fields, including formal logic, philosophy of language, and epistemology, and it continues to be a source of inspiration for discussions about the nature of truth and the limits of knowledge. By examining the paradox, we gain insight into the complexities of language and reasoning, and we are reminded of the need for more sophisticated logical frameworks to address the challenges posed by self-referential statements. The Euthyphro Dilemma is a famous philosophical problem that originates from Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, in which Socrates and Euthyphro engage in a discussion about the nature of piety and the relationship between morality and divine command. The dilemma posed in this dialogue has had a significant impact on moral philosophy, especially in the areas of ethics and the philosophy of religion. The central question of the Euthyphro Dilemma is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? This question raises important issues about the nature of morality, divine authority, and the relationship between God and ethical principles. The dilemma presents two possible answers to the question, each with its own set of philosophical implications. The first option suggests that something is good because God commands it. This position is known as divine command theory, and it implies that morality is entirely dependent on the will of God. In this view, there is no independent standard of goodness or morality beyond God's will, and whatever God commands is inherently good simply because God commands it. This view raises a number of issues, such as the problem of arbitrariness. If something is good merely because God commands it, then there seems to be no reason why God couldn't command actions that we intuitively consider immoral, like cruelty or injustice. Additionally, it would seem to undermine the objectivity of moral standards, since what is considered good would be entirely contingent on God's will. The second option presented by the Euthyphro Dilemma suggests that God commands something because it is good. This position implies that there is an independent standard of goodness that exists apart from God's will, and that God's commands are based on this standard. In this view, morality is not arbitrary but is grounded in some external or objective standard of goodness, which even God recognizes and adheres to. However, this answer leads to another problem. If goodness exists independently of God, then it seems that God is not the ultimate source of morality, and morality would exist even if God did not. This undermines the notion of God as the ultimate lawgiver or source of moral authority, and it raises questions about the nature of divine omnipotence. If there is an independent standard of goodness, then God may not have ultimate control over what is good or evil. The Euthyphro Dilemma thus creates a tension between two views of morality, one that ties moral goodness directly to the divine will, and one that suggests an external standard of goodness to which even God must adhere. Both of these options raise significant philosophical challenges that have been debated for centuries. Divine command theory, which suggests that moral goodness is determined solely by God's will, has been a dominant view in many religious traditions. In this framework, moral obligations are not seen as grounded in reason or human experience, but are instead derived from the will of God, who is assumed to be omnibenevolent and omnipotent. For adherents of divine command theory, the Euthyphro Dilemma can be seen as a challenge to the idea that God is the ultimate source of morality. If something is good merely because God commands it, then there seems to be no way to explain why God commands what He does, and there is no independent standard of goodness by which to evaluate God's commands. This creates a problem of arbitrariness. If God's will determines what is good, then there is no intrinsic reason why any particular command should be considered good, and God could theoretically command anything, even actions that we would ordinarily consider immoral, such as murder or injustice. This problem of arbitrariness has been explored by philosophers such as William of Ockham and others who have critiqued divine command theory. One of the key objections is that if morality is entirely dependent on God's will, then moral principles lose their objectivity and become entirely contingent on God's preferences. This raises questions about the nature of divine goodness. If God commands something because it is good, then goodness must exist independently of God. If, on the other hand, something is good simply because God commands it, then the concept of goodness seems arbitrary and subject to change. This dilemma, known as the problem of arbitrariness, has led some philosophers to seek alternative moral theories that do not rely on divine command theory. The second horn of the Euthyphro Dilemma, which suggests that God commands something because it is good, has its own set of challenges. This view implies that there is an independent standard of goodness that exists apart from God, and that God's commands are based on this external standard. In this case, morality is not determined by God's will, but is grounded in some objective or universal moral order. However, this raises the question of whether God is truly the ultimate source of morality if goodness exists independently of Him. If there is a standard of goodness that even God must follow, then God would not be the ultimate authority on moral matters, and morality would seem to be external to God's will. This position also raises questions about divine omnipotence. If there is an independent standard of goodness, then it suggests that God cannot change what is good or evil, since the standard exists apart from Him. This challenges the traditional understanding of divine omnipotence, which holds that God is all-powerful and able to shape all aspects of reality, including moral values. If God's commands are not the source of moral goodness, but instead are based on some external moral standard, then God's role as the ultimate lawgiver is undermined. This challenges the concept of God's sovereignty, and the idea that God's will is the ultimate basis for moral obligations. The Euthyphro Dilemma also raises broader questions about the nature of moral realism and moral objectivity. The dilemma invites us to consider whether moral truths exist independently of human or divine will, or whether moral truths are simply the result of subjective preferences or commands. If moral truths exist independently of God, then it suggests that moral facts are objective and not dependent on any particular deity's will. This view is often associated with moral realism, the idea that moral facts exist in the world in the same way that physical facts do, and that these moral facts are discoverable through reason or experience. In contrast, divine command theory implies that morality is not objective, but is instead contingent on the will of God. In this view, there are no objective moral facts that exist independently of God's commands. Instead, morality is a product of God's will, and what is considered morally right or wrong is determined solely by divine fiat. This view has been criticized by philosophers who argue that it leads to a lack of moral objectivity and makes morality arbitrary and subject to the whims of divine command. The Euthyphro Dilemma also intersects with debates in metaethics, which concerns the nature of moral language and the nature of ethical properties. Metaethicists examine whether moral statements can be objectively true or false, or whether they are merely expressions of personal or cultural preferences. The dilemma challenges us to think about the relationship between divine authority and the nature of moral truths. If moral goodness is determined solely by God's commands, then moral statements become expressions of divine will, rather than objective truths. If moral goodness exists independently of God, then it suggests that there are moral facts that can be evaluated independently of any particular divine command. The Euthyphro Dilemma remains an important and thought-provoking challenge for philosophers and theologians. It raises questions about the relationship between God and morality, the nature of divine command, and the objective nature of moral truths. Whether one adopts a divine command theory or a more independent account of moral goodness, the dilemma forces us to confront the complexities of moral reasoning and the ways in which divine authority interacts with our understanding of right and wrong. In the end, the Euthyphro Dilemma invites us to reflect on the foundations of morality and the nature of the good, and whether these foundations lie in the will of God, an independent moral order, or somewhere in between. The infinite regress of reasons is a philosophical concept that presents a challenge to our understanding of justification, explanation, and causality. It refers to a situation where every reason or explanation given for something requires another reason or explanation, which in turn requires yet another, and so on, creating an infinite chain of reasons. This infinite chain leads to a problem in trying to justify beliefs or actions, because it becomes impossible to find a final, foundational reason or explanation that does not require further justification. The issue of infinite regress is often discussed in the context of epistemology, metaphysics, and logic, and it raises important questions about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the limits of human understanding. The idea of infinite regress has been a concern for philosophers for centuries, as it touches on fundamental issues about how we come to know things and how we justify our beliefs. In the context of reasoning, an infinite regress occurs when one is asked to provide a reason or explanation for a claim, and that reason itself requires another reason, which in turn requires yet another, and so on, creating an endless chain. The result is that no final, sufficient reason or explanation is ever provided, and this can lead to a sense of intellectual paralysis or frustration. If every reason requires another, it becomes impossible to arrive at a satisfactory explanation or justification, and the process of reasoning appears to be endlessly self-referential. The problem of infinite regress is closely related to the concept of justification in epistemology, which is concerned with the conditions under which beliefs can be considered rational or warranted. In order to justify a belief, one must provide reasons or evidence to support it. However, if each reason given for a belief requires another reason, the process of justification can never be completed. This creates a situation in which it is impossible to justify a belief in a way that provides final, secure knowledge. The infinite regress problem thus challenges the very possibility of providing complete and sufficient justifications for our beliefs, and it calls into question the nature of rationality and the limits of human cognition. One of the classic examples of the infinite regress problem is found in the field of foundationalism, which is the view that knowledge and justification are ultimately based on a foundation of basic, self-evident beliefs or truths. According to foundationalism, certain beliefs or propositions are so fundamental that they do not require further justification. These foundational beliefs provide the basis for justifying other, more complex beliefs. However, if every belief requires justification from another belief, then the process of justification will never reach a foundation. Instead, the regress will continue indefinitely, making it impossible to justify any belief at all. This is a key challenge to foundationalism, as it suggests that a foundation of self-evident beliefs may not be achievable. In contrast, coherentism is another approach to justification that attempts to avoid the problem of infinite regress. Coherentism suggests that beliefs are justified not by a chain of reasons that lead to a foundation, but by the way they fit together into a coherent system. According to coherentism, a belief is justified if it is consistent with other beliefs in a network, and it does not require a final foundational belief for justification. However, while coherentism avoids the problem of infinite regress in the same way, it faces its own set of challenges, particularly the issue of circularity. If beliefs are justified by their coherence with other beliefs, it raises the question of how we know that the system of beliefs is coherent in the first place. This can lead to a form of circular reasoning, where beliefs are justified by themselves, which some philosophers argue is unsatisfactory. Another perspective on the infinite regress problem comes from externalism, a view in epistemology that holds that the justification for a belief does not necessarily depend on the subject's awareness of the reasons or evidence for that belief. Externalism suggests that beliefs can be justified by factors external to the believer's conscious reasoning process, such as the reliability of the belief-forming process or the truth of the external world. From this perspective, the infinite regress of reasons may not be a problem, because justification does not rely on an endless chain of reasons, but instead on external factors that can ground a belief. However, this view raises questions about the nature of epistemic justification, and whether it can truly be considered rational if the believer is unaware of the external factors that justify the belief. The infinite regress of reasons also has significant implications for metaphysical questions about causality and the nature of the universe. In metaphysics, the concept of an infinite regress can arise when attempting to explain the cause of something. For example, if we try to explain the existence of the universe by asking what caused it, and then seek to explain the cause of that cause, and so on, we can imagine an infinite chain of causes that never reaches a first cause. This creates a problem for any explanation of the universe, as it becomes difficult to explain how anything could exist without a starting point or ultimate cause. This issue is central to debates about the existence of God, or a first cause in cosmology and theology. Philosophers such as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas have argued that an infinite regress of causes is impossible, and that there must be a first cause that is uncaused, which they identify with God. This idea is part of the cosmological argument for the existence of God, which posits that the existence of the universe requires a necessary being to explain its origin. However, the idea of an infinite regress of causes is not universally accepted. Some philosophers argue that an infinite regress is not necessarily problematic, and that there may be ways in which causes can be linked together in an infinite chain without requiring a first cause. Others, such as proponents of eternalism, suggest that the universe may be self-sustaining and eternal, with no need for an external cause at all. These views challenge the traditional notion of a first cause, and suggest that the problem of infinite regress may not be as troubling as it initially seems. The infinite regress of reasons also plays a role in pragmatism, a philosophical tradition that emphasizes the practical consequences of beliefs and actions. Pragmatists argue that the ultimate test of a belief is its practical effectiveness, rather than its ability to be justified through an infinite chain of reasons. From a pragmatist perspective, the problem of infinite regress may be less important than the utility of a belief in guiding action and solving problems. In this view, justification is not necessarily about providing an unbroken chain of reasons, but about finding beliefs that work in practice and help us navigate the world effectively. The problem of infinite regress also has implications for epistemic humility, the idea that humans must acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge and reasoning abilities. The infinite regress of reasons reminds us that there may be limits to our ability to justify every belief or explain every phenomenon. This recognition of limits can lead to a more humble and open-minded approach to knowledge, where we accept that some questions may remain unanswered and some beliefs may never be fully justified. Epistemic humility encourages us to acknowledge the complexities of knowledge and to be cautious about claiming certainty in all matters. In conclusion, the infinite regress of reasons is a significant philosophical problem that raises important questions about justification, causality, and the limits of human knowledge. The problem challenges the idea that all beliefs or explanations must be grounded in an unbroken chain of reasons, and asks us to consider alternative approaches to justification, such as coherentism, externalism, and pragmatism. It also has metaphysical implications, particularly in debates about the existence of a first cause and the nature of the universe. Ultimately, the infinite regress of reasons forces us to confront the limits of our understanding and to reflect on the nature of knowledge, justification, and the pursuit of truth. Whether we view it as a problem to be solved or an inherent feature of human reasoning, the infinite regress invites us to explore the foundations of our beliefs and the nature of explanation itself. The duck-rabbit problem is a well-known example in philosophy and perception that demonstrates how the mind can interpret a single image in multiple ways, depending on how the observer perceives it. The image itself is an optical illusion that can be seen either as a duck or as a rabbit, and it highlights how different interpretations of the same stimulus can occur based on the cognitive framework or context in which the observer approaches it. The problem is often used in discussions about perception, the nature of reality, and the distinction between subjective and objective experiences. The duck-rabbit problem serves as a metaphor for how human beings process and understand the world, illustrating the interplay between the subjective nature of perception and the objective reality that might lie beyond individual experience. The duck-rabbit problem was first introduced by the philosopher and psychologist Joseph Jastrow in the late 19th century. The image he created was designed to show how the mind can alternate between two different interpretations of the same visual information. When viewed one way, the image appears to be a duck, with a bill and a body that suggests the shape of a waterfowl. When viewed in another way, the same image can appear as a rabbit, with long ears and a nose resembling that of a small mammal. The fascinating thing about the duck-rabbit image is that it cannot be seen as both simultaneously in the same mental context. One must switch between the two interpretations depending on how the mind chooses to focus on certain features of the image. This shifting perception of the duck-rabbit image raises important questions about the nature of perception itself. What does it mean for something to be real or objective if different observers can see the same thing in different ways? If perception is shaped by the mind's expectations, cultural background, and previous experiences, then how can we know whether our perceptions correspond to an objective reality or whether they are merely subjective constructions of the mind? These questions touch on some of the most fundamental issues in epistemology, the study of knowledge, and philosophy of mind, as they suggest that perception is not a straightforward reflection of reality, but a complex process influenced by many factors. One way to approach the duck-rabbit problem is through the lens of relativity of perception. This idea suggests that perception is not a passive process, but an active one, where the mind plays a significant role in shaping how we experience the world. According to this view, the mind is constantly organizing and interpreting sensory data based on prior knowledge, expectations, and even the mental frameworks we use to make sense of the world. When we look at the duck-rabbit image, our minds decide whether to interpret it as a duck or as a rabbit, depending on which features of the image we focus on. This highlights how our perception is not simply a matter of directly perceiving external reality, but a subjective process that can be influenced by context and prior experiences. The duck-rabbit problem also relates to Gestalt psychology, a field of psychology that emphasizes how the mind organizes sensory information into patterns or wholes. According to Gestalt theory, the brain does not merely process isolated pieces of information, but seeks to organize and interpret that information in terms of larger patterns and structures. The duck-rabbit image exemplifies this process. Depending on how the mind organizes the visual information, the same image can appear as one thing or another. This shows how perception is not simply a matter of passive observation, but an active process of creating meaning and structure out of sensory input. The Gestalt approach to perception suggests that the mind works to make sense of the world by grouping elements together into meaningful configurations, and these configurations can shift depending on the individual's mental focus. In addition to its implications for the study of perception, the duck-rabbit problem has important consequences for the philosophy of language and meaning. The fact that the same image can be seen as either a duck or a rabbit suggests that meaning is not inherent in the image itself, but is constructed by the observer. This has parallels to debates in philosophy about whether meaning is intrinsic to objects and events in the world, or whether it is created by human beings through interpretation. The duck-rabbit image suggests that meaning is not a fixed, objective quality of the world, but a dynamic process that depends on the way the observer interprets the world. This idea is central to interpretivism, a philosophical stance that argues that meaning is shaped by human perception and social context, rather than being an objective property of the world. Moreover, the duck-rabbit problem has relevance for epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge. The fact that two observers can look at the same image and come away with different interpretations raises the question of whether knowledge is objective or subjective. Can we truly know the world as it is, or are our perceptions always colored by our individual perspectives? The duck-rabbit problem challenges the idea that perception provides direct access to an objective reality. Instead, it suggests that our knowledge of the world is always mediated by the mind, which filters and interprets sensory data in ways that can differ from person to person. This raises important questions about the reliability of perception and the limits of human knowledge, especially when it comes to understanding the nature of external objects and events. The duck-rabbit problem also has implications for philosophy of mind, particularly with regard to the concept of intentionality. Intentionality refers to the capacity of the mind to be directed toward or about something, such as when we think about objects, concepts, or events. The duck-rabbit image exemplifies how the mind can shift its focus from one interpretation to another, depending on which features are emphasized. This shifting focus highlights the mind's active role in constructing meaning and interpreting sensory information. In this sense, the duck-rabbit image can be seen as a metaphor for the mind's ability to direct attention and interpret the world in different ways. The mind, in this view, is not simply a passive receiver of information, but an active participant in shaping our experience of reality. The duck-rabbit problem also has philosophical implications for theories of perception that are concerned with how we come to know the world through our senses. Some theories of perception, such as naive realism, suggest that perception is a direct reflection of the external world. In other words, what we see is what is actually there. However, the duck-rabbit problem challenges this view by showing that the same sensory information can be interpreted in different ways, depending on the observer's perspective. This suggests that perception is not a simple mirroring of the external world, but a more complex process of interpretation and meaning-making. The duck-rabbit image, in this respect, highlights the importance of considering the role of the mind in shaping perception and understanding. In addition to its philosophical significance, the duck-rabbit problem also has applications in art and visual perception. The ability of the image to shift between different interpretations mirrors the way in which art can provoke multiple interpretations and responses from viewers. An artwork may be seen differently depending on the viewer's personal experiences, cultural background, and cognitive framework. This highlights the role of interpretation in art and how meaning is not simply dictated by the artist, but is co-constructed by the viewer. In conclusion, the duck-rabbit problem is a thought-provoking example of how perception is not a passive process, but an active and interpretive one. It raises important questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and meaning, and it challenges the idea that our perceptions correspond directly to an objective external world. The problem highlights the complexity of human perception and the ways in which the mind shapes our experience of the world. Through its demonstration of shifting interpretations, the duck-rabbit image serves as a powerful metaphor for the fluidity of meaning and the subjective nature of perception, offering insights into the interplay between the objective world and the mind's interpretation of it. The sleeping pill dilemma is a thought experiment that explores ethical questions related to autonomy, consent, and the nature of personal well-being. This dilemma involves a person who is offered a sleeping pill that will make them fall into a deep, peaceful sleep, one in which they will feel no distress or discomfort. However, the catch is that while the person will experience a sense of tranquility and comfort, they will lose all sense of autonomy, free will, and engagement with the world. The dilemma raises crucial questions about whether it is ethically justifiable to choose such an option and what it means to live a good life. It also touches on themes related to the value of active engagement with reality versus passive escapism. At its core, the sleeping pill dilemma revolves around the tension between two contrasting perspectives on well-being. On one side is the idea that a good life is one in which a person has agency, autonomy, and an active role in shaping their experiences, choices, and actions. On the other side is the notion that well-being can be measured in terms of inner peace and the absence of suffering, where the tranquil, unengaged life might be considered desirable if it leads to contentment. The dilemma forces individuals to confront the question of whether it is preferable to live a life full of challenges, decision-making, and uncertainty, or whether it is better to accept an existence that is free of distress but also devoid of personal autonomy. The sleeping pill dilemma presents several important philosophical issues related to ethics, human nature, and the meaning of life. One of the key issues is the concept of autonomy, which refers to an individual's capacity for self-determination and self-governance. In this scenario, the person offered the pill is faced with a choice. They can continue to engage with the world, make decisions, and experience both joy and suffering, or they can take the pill and enter a state of unconscious bliss that removes all responsibility and active participation. The dilemma raises the question of whether autonomy is essential for a fulfilling life, or whether a life devoid of struggle and choice can still be considered meaningful. Another important issue raised by the sleeping pill dilemma is the question of suffering, and how it fits into our understanding of well-being. Some philosophers argue that suffering is an inevitable and necessary part of the human experience, and that it can lead to personal growth, resilience, and the development of meaningful connections with others. From this perspective, a life that avoids suffering through a passive, sleep-like state might be seen as lacking in depth and significance. On the other hand, there are those who argue that the goal of life should be to minimize suffering and maximize happiness, in which case the sleeping pill could be seen as a rational choice if it leads to the greatest possible well-being. This tension between suffering and happiness is central to the dilemma, as it raises the question of whether we should prioritize a life of meaningful struggle or a life of peaceful escape. The dilemma also intersects with the question of personal responsibility and the role of choice in shaping one's life. In the sleeping pill scenario, the person is given the power to make a choice that will fundamentally alter their existence. However, this choice is not as simple as it might first appear. If the person chooses the pill, they are essentially relinquishing their agency and opting for a passive existence. This raises the question of whether it is ethical to choose a life that removes the responsibility of decision-making and engagement with the world. Some philosophers argue that part of what makes a life meaningful is the ability to make choices, confront challenges, and take responsibility for one's actions. In this sense, choosing the pill might be seen as an abdication of personal responsibility, leading to a life that is less meaningful, even if it is free of suffering. In contrast, others might argue that the decision to take the sleeping pill is a legitimate exercise of autonomy, as the individual is free to choose the kind of life they want to live. From this perspective, the person's choice to opt for peace and tranquility can be seen as a valid expression of personal preferences. After all, if the individual values comfort and freedom from pain more than engagement with the world, then taking the pill could be viewed as a rational decision in pursuit of their own well-being. This highlights a conflict between two different conceptions of autonomy, one that emphasizes active engagement and decision-making, and another that values the freedom to pursue personal happiness, even if it involves retreating from the complexities of life. A related issue that the sleeping pill dilemma brings to light is the question of the value of life experiences. Is the value of life measured by the experiences we have, including the challenges, setbacks, and triumphs, or is it more about the absence of pain and the attainment of a state of pure contentment? The dilemma suggests that the richness of human experience, whether joyful or painful, could be considered essential to a fulfilling life. Philosophers who emphasize the importance of life experiences argue that meaning is found in the struggle, the growth, and the relationships that arise from facing life's difficulties. In this view, taking the pill and removing oneself from active participation in the world would be a form of self-imposed stagnation, depriving the individual of the full spectrum of life's possibilities. On the other hand, those who focus on the subjective experience of happiness and well-being might argue that there is nothing inherently wrong with choosing a life of peace and tranquility, free from suffering. In this view, happiness or contentment is the ultimate goal, and the absence of pain should not be undervalued. If the sleeping pill provides an individual with a sense of calm and satisfaction, then it could be considered a morally acceptable choice, as it serves the person's best interests and respects their autonomy to determine the kind of life they wish to lead. The question then becomes whether happiness derived from a passive, unengaged life is genuinely fulfilling, or whether true well-being requires active involvement in the world. The sleeping pill dilemma also raises important questions about the role of philosophical and ethical theories in guiding decisions about life and well-being. Some ethical frameworks, such as utilitarianism, might support the idea of taking the pill, as it could be seen as a way to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the individual. Utilitarians focus on the consequences of actions, and if taking the pill leads to greater happiness, then it could be viewed as the morally right choice. However, other ethical theories, such as deontology, emphasize the importance of duty, responsibility, and moral obligations. From a deontological perspective, choosing the pill might be seen as morally wrong because it involves abdicating responsibility and agency, which are essential components of living an ethical life. The dilemma also draws attention to the psychological and emotional aspects of human nature. It forces us to ask whether the pursuit of happiness should be our ultimate goal, or whether something deeper, such as a sense of purpose or fulfillment, is more important. In this sense, the dilemma serves as a vehicle for reflecting on what it means to live a good life and what we truly value. Is it peace and serenity? Or is it engagement, struggle, and growth? The sleeping pill dilemma asks us to consider whether it is better to live a life that is full of experiences, including the potential for suffering, or whether we should aim for a state of tranquility, free from the burdens of existence. In conclusion, the sleeping pill dilemma is a complex thought experiment that raises critical questions about autonomy, well-being, suffering, and the nature of a meaningful life. It forces us to confront the tension between the desire for comfort and peace and the value of active participation in the world, with all its challenges and uncertainties. by presenting a choice between two fundamentally different ways of living. The dilemma encourages us to reflect on our own values and what we consider to be essential for a fulfilling existence. Whether one prioritizes autonomy, happiness, or the richness of life experiences, the dilemma challenges us to think deeply about what it means to live a life worth living. The paradox of omniscience is a philosophical dilemma that explores the implications of an all-knowing being, often discussed in the context of theology and philosophy of mind. Omniscience is traditionally understood as the attribute of being all-knowing, a property ascribed to God in many religious traditions. The paradox arises when we consider the nature of such perfect knowledge and the potential contradictions it creates with other important concepts, such as free will, the passage of time, and the possibility of change. The paradox of omniscience challenges our understanding of knowledge, agency, and the limits of human cognition, raising significant questions about how an all-knowing being would interact with the world and whether omniscience is even logically possible. One of the central issues in the paradox of omniscience is the tension between omniscience and free will. If an omniscient being knows everything that will happen in the future, including all of the choices and actions that free agents will make, then it seems that human beings have no real freedom to choose their actions. This raises the problem of determinism, the idea that every event or action is determined by preceding causes. If the future is already known and predetermined by an all-knowing being, then the concept of free will appears to be undermined. The paradox questions whether true freedom can exist in a world where an omniscient being already knows all outcomes, and whether knowledge of future events restricts the possibility of choosing freely. The issue becomes even more complicated when we consider the idea that an omniscient being knows not only the future actions of individuals, but also every possible contingency and outcome in the universe. If this being knows all possibilities, does that imply that there is only one possible future? Or is the future still open, in some sense, despite the being's perfect knowledge? The paradox forces us to grapple with questions about the nature of time, and whether knowledge of future events somehow diminishes the open-ended nature of time. Can an all-knowing being's awareness of the future coexist with the idea that the future is open to change, or is the future, in some sense, fixed and unalterable because of that knowledge? Another significant aspect of the paradox of omniscience is the problem of timelessness. Omniscience is often attributed to a being that exists outside of time, such as God in many theological traditions. This being is supposed to know the entirety of reality, past, present, and future, simultaneously. However, if this being is timeless and exists beyond the flow of time, it becomes difficult to understand how such a being can engage with the world or exercise knowledge in a way that is meaningful to finite beings who experience time. For example, how can an omniscient, timeless being know the specific actions of a person at a particular moment in time if it exists outside the framework of time itself? Does the timeless nature of omniscience conflict with the experience of time as humans understand it? The paradox asks whether it is logically coherent for a being to possess knowledge of events within time while being outside of time. Additionally, the paradox raises the question of how an omniscient being interacts with change and novelty. If an omniscient being knows all things, including every future event, then there is no room for surprise, learning, or discovery. This challenges the idea of progress or development within the universe, as it implies that everything is already known and fixed in advance. For example, if the being knows every action that will ever take place, does that mean there is no real potential for growth or change in the world? It also suggests that the concept of surprise or learning is meaningless for an omniscient being. as it would already be aware of all outcomes. In this sense, the paradox questions whether an all-knowing being could truly engage with the world in a dynamic, meaningful way, or whether their knowledge would prevent the unfolding of new experiences and opportunities for growth. The paradox of omniscience also touches on the problem of logical consistency, and whether it is even possible for a being to possess absolute knowledge. Some philosophers argue that omniscience may be logically incoherent or self-contradictory. If an omniscient being knows all things, then it must know the truths of logic, mathematics, and metaphysics as well as all contingent facts about the world. However, there are certain logical paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, "This sentence is false," that challenge the very concept of knowledge itself. Can a being who knows everything also know paradoxical or self-referential truths that defy traditional understanding of truth and knowledge? This problem suggests that omniscience may not be logically consistent, as there are contradictions inherent in the very idea of knowing all things. Another dimension of the paradox of omniscience is the problem of evil. In religious and theological discussions, the problem of evil arises when we consider the coexistence of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being with the existence of suffering and evil in the world. If such a being knows everything, including all instances of suffering, then why does it allow evil to exist? The paradox challenges the idea of a perfect being who is both all-knowing and all-good, as the presence of suffering in the world seems incompatible with perfect knowledge and benevolence. If the omniscient being knows about suffering and could prevent it, why does it allow evil to persist? This dilemma is central to theodicy, the philosophical defense of God's goodness in the face of evil, and it raises significant questions about the nature of divine knowledge, morality, and the role of suffering in the world. The paradox of omniscience is also related to the question of human epistemology, how we come to know the world, and whether it is possible for human beings to approach anything close to omniscience. While humans are limited by their finite knowledge and experience, the paradox forces us to consider the implications of limitless knowledge. If humans were to possess omniscience, what would it mean for our ability to act, choose, and relate to the world? Would we be paralyzed by the overwhelming scope of all-knowing understanding, or would omniscience simply be a means of understanding the ultimate truths of existence? The paradox encourages us to reflect on the limits of human knowledge, and whether perfect knowledge would be desirable, or if there are inherent dangers or ethical concerns associated with such knowledge. One additional philosophical aspect of the paradox of omniscience is its impact on morality. If an omniscient being knows every possible action and consequence, can such a being truly be said to make free choices? The paradox raises questions about moral responsibility, and whether the existence of omniscience undermines the very concept of moral agency. If everything is already known, does this mean that no moral choice is truly free, or can an omniscient being still be responsible for its actions? The paradox also leads us to consider the role of knowledge in moral decision-making, whether knowing every possible outcome of a situation makes it impossible to act freely, or whether there is still room for moral choice, even in the face of perfect knowledge. In conclusion, the paradox of omniscience raises important and profound questions about the nature of knowledge, time, free will, and moral responsibility. It challenges our understanding of how perfect knowledge can coexist with a dynamic, changing world, and whether such knowledge is even logically possible. The paradox also highlights tensions between theological concepts such as divine omniscience and the existence of human freedom, suffering, and evil. By forcing us to grapple with the limits of human understanding and the complexities of perfect knowledge, the paradox of omniscience encourages reflection on the very nature of existence, knowledge, and the challenges of reconciling divine attributes with the realities of the world we experience. The experience machine is a thought experiment introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The thought experiment is designed to challenge the idea that pleasure or happiness is the ultimate goal in life. It raises significant questions about what makes life meaningful, and whether the pursuit of pleasure and subjective experience should be prioritized over other aspects of human existence. The experience machine asks whether people would choose to plug into a machine that would provide them with a perfect, simulated reality tailored to their desires, or whether they would prefer to live in the real world, with all its challenges, unpredictability, and imperfections. Through this dilemma, Nozick explores the nature of happiness, fulfillment, and the value of reality itself. The thought experiment begins with a simple proposition. Imagine there is a machine that can simulate any experience you desire. You could experience limitless pleasures, accomplishments, and idealized versions of your life, all perfectly tailored to your tastes. Once plugged in, you would lose all awareness that you are in a simulated environment, and you would live your entire life in this artificial experience, with no distinction between the simulated and the real. The question is whether, if offered the choice, you would opt to plug into this machine, or prefer to live in the real world, with its uncertainties, challenges, and imperfections. Nozick uses the experience machine to illustrate the hedonistic paradox, the idea that pleasure is not the only or ultimate source of meaning in life. The paradox suggests that, while it might seem that the best life is one full of pleasure and happiness, there is something more to life than simply maximizing pleasure. The experience machine forces us to consider whether we would genuinely prefer a life of artificial pleasure over a real life, even if the real life includes suffering, hardship, and unfulfilled desires. Nozick argues that the fact that most people would choose to avoid the machine, preferring to live in the real world, with all its challenges, suggests that there is more to life than mere pleasure. This dilemma raises several critical philosophical questions related to the nature of happiness and well-being. One of the main questions it challenges is whether subjective experience, the feeling of happiness, pleasure, or fulfillment, should be considered the most important aspect of a good life. The experience machine invites us to reflect on whether a life of simulated pleasure, free of pain and dissatisfaction, can truly be considered a fulfilling life. If pleasure is the ultimate goal, then the machine should theoretically offer the best possible life. However, the thought experiment suggests that many people would reject the machine, indicating that there is something more valuable than simply the experience of happiness. The experience machine also challenges the idea that authenticity or realness is irrelevant to well-being. The fact that the machine provides artificial experiences makes it fundamentally different from real life. If people would choose the real world over the machine, it suggests that there is something intrinsically valuable about experiencing reality, even with all its imperfections and uncertainties. This touches on the importance of authenticity in human life. Many people seem to value the genuine, unaltered experience of life, even if it means encountering pain, loss, and struggle. The idea of living an artificial life within the machine conflicts with the human desire for genuine experiences, relationships, and personal growth, which are often seen as essential to a meaningful existence. Furthermore, the experience machine forces us to think about the role of personal development and achievement in the pursuit of happiness. While the machine offers a life full of pleasurable experiences, it does not provide opportunities for real growth or meaningful accomplishment. In the real world, we often derive satisfaction from overcoming obstacles, achieving personal goals, and developing our skills. A life in the machine, by contrast, would be static, without real challenges or progress. This raises the question of whether personal development and the pursuit of goals are integral to a fulfilling life, even if they come with struggle and hardship. Many people seem to find meaning in the process of striving toward something, even if it involves discomfort and difficulty, which stands in contrast to the passive, pleasure-filled existence offered by the machine. The thought experiment also speaks to the nature of relationships and human connection. The experience machine is a solitary experience, one in which the individual is the center of their own reality, surrounded by simulations that cater to their desires. Real life, on the other hand, involves relationships with other people, including the potential for love, friendship, conflict, and shared experiences. It suggests that human connection is a crucial element of a meaningful life. Even though relationships can be challenging and emotionally complex, they are an integral part of the human experience, and many people would argue that the value of relationships goes beyond the mere pleasure or satisfaction they bring. In a simulated reality, where all interactions are artificial, the deeper emotional and social aspects of life would be lost, making it less likely that one would find genuine fulfillment. In addition to these personal aspects of the dilemma, the experience machine also raises questions about the value of knowledge and truth. In the machine, the person experiences what they believe to be reality, but it is ultimately an illusion. This presents a contrast with the value of knowing the truth, regardless of whether it is comfortable or desirable. People often seem to value truth for its own sake, even when it leads to unpleasant realizations or challenges their beliefs. The idea that one might prefer an illusion of happiness to a life of genuine knowledge raises the question of whether truth is an intrinsic part of human flourishing. In this context, the rejection of the experience machine could be interpreted as a commitment to the idea that knowledge and authenticity are more important than pleasure, even if that knowledge brings discomfort. The experience machine also has significant implications for the philosophy of ethics and moral responsibility. If one could live a life of perfect simulated experiences, free from pain or suffering, would it matter whether those experiences are morally good or bad? In the machine, the individual could live a morally neutral or even morally questionable life, as the consequences of their actions would not have any real impact on others or the world. This raises questions about the nature of moral responsibility, whether morality is important only because of the real-world consequences of our actions, or whether there is a deeper value in making morally right choices, regardless of the external outcomes. If people reject the machine in favor of living in a world where moral choices have real consequences, it suggests that there is more to a good life than simply maximizing personal pleasure. Moral integrity, responsibility, and the impact of our actions on others could be seen as essential components of a meaningful existence. From a more practical standpoint, the experience machine also highlights the limits of simulation and artificial experience. While the machine promises the perfect simulated life, it cannot replicate the full complexity and unpredictability of the real world. Life is inherently uncertain, and much of its meaning comes from the unexpected events, relationships, and discoveries that cannot be programmed or anticipated. The experience of living in a dynamic, ever-changing world offers unique opportunities for growth, learning, and connection that cannot be replicated in a machine. This suggests that while simulated experiences may provide temporary pleasure or satisfaction, they lack the depth, authenticity, and complexity that make life meaningful. In conclusion, the experience machine raises profound questions about the nature of happiness, authenticity, personal development, relationships, and moral responsibility. It challenges the idea that pleasure or happiness is the ultimate goal of life. encouraging us to think about whether a meaningful life requires more than just the experience of satisfaction. The thought experiment asks whether people would choose to live a simulated existence of perfect pleasure, or whether they would prefer to face the challenges, unpredictability, and imperfections of the real world. Ultimately, it suggests that there is more to a fulfilling life than simply maximizing pleasure, and that the authentic, dynamic, and unpredictable nature of reality holds value in its own right. The experience machine invites us to reflect on what makes life truly meaningful, and whether we are willing to trade that meaning for the comfort of artificial pleasure. The lottery coincidence is a philosophical thought experiment that explores the nature of probability, luck, and the concept of coincidence. The scenario revolves around an individual who wins the lottery, but the twist is that the individual wins on the same day that they also happen to be thinking about winning the lottery or dreaming of it. This coincidence raises significant questions about the role of chance, fate, and the nature of probability in shaping events in our lives. The lottery coincidence challenges our understanding of how much control we truly have over the events that occur to us, and whether there is any deeper meaning or significance behind what seems like pure, random chance. The thought experiment begins with the premise that someone wins the lottery, but it happens on a day when they were thinking about winning the lottery, or imagining how it would feel to become a millionaire. The individual may even have bought the lottery ticket with the idea in mind that they would win, or they may have been fantasizing about the possibilities before the winning numbers are drawn. The coincidence of winning on the same day that they were thinking about it seems remarkable and unusual. At first glance, it may seem like there is something more than just randomness at play. Is this simply a lucky coincidence, or is there something deeper going on? Is the lottery win a result of mere chance, or is it somehow connected to the individual's thoughts, desires, or intentions? One of the central themes that the lottery coincidence touches on is the role of probability in our lives. Lotteries, by their very nature, are games of chance, where the probability of winning is extremely low. Yet, when someone wins a lottery, it is often perceived as a stroke of luck, a rare and extraordinary event. The thought experiment challenges us to reflect on the nature of probability, and whether our perception of coincidence is influenced by the rarity or improbability of an event. In this case, the coincidence of winning the lottery on the same day that one is thinking about it may seem especially remarkable, because the odds of winning are so low, and the alignment of thoughts and events appears uncanny. However, from a statistical perspective, it may simply be a matter of the many possible outcomes that could occur in a world where random events happen every day. The rarity of the event doesn't necessarily mean that there is a deeper meaning or connection, but the human tendency to seek patterns and significance in random occurrences often leads us to interpret such events as more meaningful than they may actually be. The lottery coincidence also explores the idea of confirmation bias, which is the tendency to interpret information in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs or expectations. When someone wins the lottery after thinking about it or fantasizing about it, they may be more likely to focus on that particular event and consider it a significant coincidence. They may overlook the countless other times when they thought about winning the lottery without any actual results. In this sense, the event is not as extraordinary as it might initially appear, because the individual is selectively paying attention to the moments when their thoughts align with their circumstances. This reflects the way humans tend to give undue importance to rare events that match their expectations or desires, while ignoring or downplaying the numerous occurrences that don't fit within that narrative. The lottery. Coincidence, in this light, serves as a reminder that our perceptions of chance and coincidence can be shaped by our biases, and that we may not always be able to accurately judge the true significance of events. Another important aspect of the thought experiment is the question of free will. and whether the individual's thoughts or desires can influence the course of events. If someone wins the lottery on the same day they were thinking about it, it may seem like their thoughts had some kind of causal effect on the outcome. This raises the question of whether our intentions and mental states have the power to shape the world around us, or whether events are purely determined by external factors beyond our control. In the case of the lottery, it is unlikely that the individual's thoughts directly influenced the outcome, as the lottery is governed by random chance. However, the apparent coincidence can prompt us to reflect on the limits of human agency and the role that chance plays in our lives. Are we truly the masters of our own fate, or are we subject to forces beyond our control? The lottery coincidence serves as a reminder of the tension between free will and the randomness of life, and the difficulty of drawing clear boundaries between what we can control and what is beyond our influence. Additionally, the lottery coincidence raises important questions about the concept of meaning and how we find significance in our lives. When something unexpected and rare happens, such as winning the lottery, it is natural to search for meaning or significance behind the event. The coincidence of thinking about winning and then actually winning can make the experience feel especially meaningful, as it seems to align with the individual's desires or dreams. However, the event may ultimately be just a random occurrence, with no deeper significance or connection to the individual's thoughts. The human tendency to find meaning in random events is a common psychological phenomenon known as apophenia, the perception of meaningful patterns in random data. The lottery coincidence, in this sense, highlights the way people seek meaning in their lives, even in situations where no inherent meaning may exist. It challenges us to consider how much of the meaning we attribute to events is constructed by our minds, and how much of it is a product of the events themselves. The thought experiment also touches on the narrative nature of human experience. Humans are naturally inclined to construct stories about their lives and the events that shape them. When an extraordinary event occurs, such as winning the lottery, it often becomes a central part of the individual's personal narrative. The coincidence of thinking about winning and then winning can provide a sense of coherence and purpose to the individual's life story, as if the event is part of a larger pattern or destiny. This sense of narrative can make the event seem more significant than it might otherwise be, as the individual tries to fit the event into a larger, meaningful framework. The lottery coincidence prompts us to reflect on how we create meaning through the stories we tell ourselves about our lives and the events that shape our experiences. Another interesting aspect of the lottery coincidence is its relationship to the law of large numbers, a principle in probability theory that suggests that, as the number of trials increases, the observed frequency of an event will approach its theoretical probability. In a world with countless individuals engaging in activities like purchasing lottery tickets, it is not particularly surprising that some people will experience rare events, such as winning the lottery, on occasion. The sheer volume of people engaging in random processes increases the likelihood that seemingly improbable events will occur. The lottery coincidence, therefore, may not be as remarkable as it initially seems when viewed from the perspective of large numbers and statistical probability. The concept of randomness and probability suggests that coincidences, even extraordinary ones, may not be as unusual as they appear when considered within a broader context. In conclusion, the lottery coincidence challenges our understanding of probability, luck, and coincidence, and invites us to reflect on how we interpret rare or improbable events. It raises important questions about the role of chance in our lives, the ways in which we construct meaning, and the biases that shape our perceptions of events. The thought experiment also explores the tension between free will and randomness, prompting us to consider how much control we have over the events that unfold in our lives. Ultimately, the lottery coincidence serves as a reminder that life is full of unpredictable events, and that our tendency to search for meaning and significance in those events may not always be grounded in objective reality. The experience of coincidence, while often striking and intriguing, is ultimately a product of randomness and probability, and it is up to each individual to decide how to interpret and assign meaning to the events that shape their lives. The problem of evil is one of the oldest and most significant challenges in philosophy and theology, primarily focused on the apparent contradiction between the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God and the presence of evil in the world. The dilemma asks why a perfectly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God would allow suffering, pain, and evil to exist in the world. It has been a central issue for philosophers, theologians, and thinkers throughout history, and continues to be a key point of contention in discussions about the nature of God, free will, and the meaning of human suffering. The problem of evil is typically formulated as a paradox. If God is omnipotent, meaning that he has unlimited power, he should be able to prevent evil. If God is omniscient, meaning he knows everything, he should be aware of all instances of evil and suffering. And if God is omnibenevolent, meaning he is perfectly good, he should want to eliminate evil and suffering in order to create a world that reflects his goodness. Yet, evil and suffering exist in the world, which seems to present a contradiction. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God allow such evil to persist? This paradox has been the subject of much debate, and several responses have been proposed over time, both from philosophical and religious perspectives. One of the most well-known responses to the problem of evil is the concept of free will. According to this argument, God has given human beings free will, the ability to choose between good and evil. Free will is seen as a necessary condition for moral responsibility and authentic love. If people were incapable of choosing evil, their good actions would be meaningless, as they would not have the ability to choose them freely. The existence of evil is, therefore, a consequence of human free will, as individuals make choices that lead to suffering and wrongdoing. In this view, the presence of evil is not a reflection of God's failure to act, but a result of the freedom that God grants humanity. The free will defense, however, has its limitations. Critics argue that even if free will allows for the possibility of evil, it does not explain why God would allow so much suffering, particularly the suffering of innocent people. For instance, why would an all-knowing and all-powerful God permit the suffering of children, the innocent, or those who have no capacity for choosing evil? The sheer extent of suffering and evil in the world seems disproportionate to the need for free will, prompting some to question whether the free will defense adequately addresses the problem of evil. Another response to the problem of evil is the concept of soul-making. This argument, popularized by philosopher John Hick, suggests that the existence of evil and suffering is necessary for the development of human virtues and moral growth. According to this view, God allows evil in the world as a means of shaping and refining human beings into morally mature individuals. The challenges and hardships of life provide opportunities for people to develop virtues such as courage, compassion, and empathy. Without the presence of evil and suffering, it might be impossible for individuals to achieve moral excellence or realize their full potential as human beings. In this framework, the existence of evil is seen as a necessary component of the process of soul-making, where individuals grow spiritually and morally through their responses to suffering. While the soul-making defense provides a plausible explanation for the existence of evil from a developmental perspective, it faces challenges as well. One of the primary criticisms is that the amount and intensity of suffering in the world seem excessive for the purpose of moral growth. For example, the suffering of individuals who experience extreme poverty, torture, or natural disasters raises the question of whether such intense suffering is really necessary for the development of virtues. Furthermore, the soul-making argument relies on the assumption that all suffering can lead to moral and spiritual growth, which may not always be the case. Some individuals may experience suffering that leads to despair or cynicism rather than moral development. As such, the soul-making defense does not fully address the problem of evil for those who argue that the existence of extreme suffering is unjustifiable. Another response to the problem of evil is the idea that evil and suffering are necessary for the greater good. This argument asserts that, although the presence of evil may be difficult to understand, it serves a greater purpose in the divine plan. Perhaps evil is necessary to bring about a greater good, such as the cultivation of virtues, the fulfillment of divine purposes, or the realization of a higher order of existence. This perspective is often referred to as the greater good defense. According to this view, God allows evil to exist because it ultimately serves a purpose that is beyond human understanding. The existence of suffering and evil may be part of a divine plan that, while inscrutable to human beings, ultimately results in a greater good. While the greater good defense offers a potential justification for the existence of evil, it also faces criticism. One of the key criticisms is that the extent of suffering in the world seems disproportionate to any conceivable greater good. The suffering of innocent individuals, particularly in cases of natural disasters, diseases, or violence, appears gratuitous and unnecessary. Additionally, the greater good defense often assumes that human beings are incapable of fully understanding the divine plan, which raises questions about the nature of God's benevolence. If God's plan involves allowing immense suffering for the sake of a greater good, is that consistent with the idea of a perfectly good God? Some critics argue that the greater good defense could lead to a situation where God's goodness is called into question, as it seems to justify extreme and unnecessary suffering. A more radical response to the problem of evil comes from the perspective of process theology. Process theology, rooted in the work of philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, suggests that God is not omnipotent in the classical sense. Instead of being all-powerful, God is seen as being in a process of growth and development alongside creation. According to this view, God cannot control every aspect of the world and is not fully responsible for the existence of evil and suffering. Rather, God works within the constraints of the world, striving to bring about the best possible outcomes in an ever-changing and unpredictable universe. In process theology, the existence of evil is not seen as a failure of God's power or goodness, but as a necessary consequence of the dynamic, evolving nature of reality. This view allows for the possibility of evil, while maintaining that God is still involved in the world, working to bring about good even in the face of suffering. While process theology offers an innovative perspective on the problem of evil, it also challenges traditional views of God's omnipotence and omniscience. Critics argue that if God is not all-powerful, then the classical conception of God as the creator and sustainer of the universe is undermined. Moreover, if God cannot fully prevent evil, it raises questions about God's ultimate nature and role in the world. Process theology, though thought-provoking, does not offer a definitive solution to the problem of evil in the traditional sense, and presents a more complex and nuanced view of God's relationship with the world. In addition to these theodicies, the problem of evil has led to several atheistic or agnostic perspectives. One such response is the argument from gratuitous evil, which argues that the existence of certain forms of evil, particularly suffering that appears pointless and unjustifiable, provides evidence against the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. If God were truly omnipotent and omnibenevolent, the argument goes, he would prevent even the smallest amount of unnecessary suffering. The fact that there is seemingly unnecessary evil in the world calls into question the traditional attributes of God and challenges the belief in a benevolent deity. In conclusion, the problem of evil remains one of the most complex and enduring challenges in philosophy and theology. The existence of evil and suffering in the world seems to be in direct conflict with the idea of a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Various responses have been proposed to reconcile this apparent contradiction, including the free will defense, the soul-making theodicy, the greater good defense, process theology, and others. While none of these responses fully resolves the problem of evil to everyone's satisfaction, they continue to shape discussions about the nature of God, the meaning of suffering, and the role of free will in the human experience. Ultimately, the problem of evil encourages deep reflection on the nature of good and evil, the limitations of human understanding, and the complexities of the human condition. The burden of proof is a foundational concept in logic, philosophy, and legal reasoning. It determines who has the responsibility to provide evidence in a debate or dispute. Typically, it falls on the party making a claim, especially if that claim is extraordinary or goes against established knowledge. However, a paradox arises when we examine the implications of this principle more closely. The paradox of the burden of proof emerges in contexts where determining who must provide evidence is itself a matter of dispute. This issue can be seen in philosophical debates, legal systems, and even everyday arguments, often leading to logical standstills or unfair expectations. The burden of proof has been a crucial element in philosophy and law for centuries. In legal systems, it is usually assigned to the prosecution in criminal cases, based on the presumption of innocence. The accused does not have to prove their innocence. Rather, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This principle is intended to prevent wrongful convictions and ensure fairness. However, there are cases where the burden shifts. For instance, in civil cases, the burden of proof may be shared or reversed depending on circumstances, and in affirmative defenses, the defendant must provide supporting evidence. In philosophical discourse, particularly in discussions about the existence of deities, supernatural phenomena, or controversial scientific theories, the burden of proof often becomes a central point of contention. The default stance in epistemology is that the one making a claim must provide evidence. This principle aligns with the idea that skepticism should be the default position, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. However, the paradox emerges when one party refuses to accept the distribution of burden, or when defining what constitutes sufficient proof becomes subjective. One of the key aspects of the paradox of the burden of proof is the difficulty of proving a negative. If one is asked to prove that something does not exist, the task can be nearly impossible. For example, proving that there are no fairies requires exhaustive examination of every possible place where fairies might exist. This is one reason why skeptics argue that the burden of proof should always be on the person making a positive claim rather than on those denying it. Yet, some claim that the absence of evidence for something does not necessarily mean evidence of its absence, which further complicates the debate. Another manifestation of this paradox appears in legal contexts where proving innocence is not always straightforward. While the principle of presumed innocence protects defendants from having to prove they did not commit a crime, there are cases where public perception or circumstantial evidence reverses this expectation. The paradox becomes evident when someone falsely accused must provide proof of their innocence beyond mere lack of evidence against them. In everyday discussions, people often shift the burden of proof unfairly. For instance, someone might make an assertion and then demand that others disprove it rather than providing their own supporting evidence. This is commonly seen in pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, and political debates. If one claims that a secret organization controls the world and then insists that skeptics prove otherwise, they engage in an unreasonable shifting of the burden of proof. This tactic can make baseless claims appear more credible simply because disproving them comprehensively is an impossible task. The paradox of the burden of proof is also evident in scientific debates. In scientific methodology, claims require empirical evidence and must be testable. Scientists proposing a new theory must provide supporting evidence, while those challenging it must present counter-evidence. However, in cases where existing knowledge is questioned, disputes arise over whether the challenger must prove the inadequacy of the current model or the proponent of the existing model must reinforce its validity. This can lead to stagnation in certain scientific fields where controversial ideas struggle to gain legitimacy. An interesting illustration of the paradox occurs in historical debates. When interpreting past events, historians rely on available evidence. However, when evidence is lacking, it is difficult to determine whether an event did not occur or whether the evidence has simply been lost. This creates a burden of proof dilemma, as those asserting a historical event must rely on fragmentary evidence, while skeptics might argue that absence of evidence suggests absence of occurrence. In political discourse, burden of proof issues arise when policies are debated. Suppose one politician argues that a new policy will significantly improve the economy, while another argues that it will cause harm. Who bears the burden of proof? Should the proponent prove that their policy will succeed, or should the opponent prove that it will fail? In many cases, both sides demand that the other provide definitive evidence, leading to a deadlock in decision-making. This further exemplifies how burden of proof disputes can create logical and practical dilemmas. Another facet of this paradox occurs in ethical debates. For example, in discussions about moral responsibility, who must prove that a particular action is ethical or unethical? Ethical theories often rely on different foundational assumptions, making it difficult to determine who should provide justification for their stance. If one side argues that an action is morally unacceptable, is it their responsibility to prove why, or must the opposing side prove that it is acceptable? Psychologically, the burden of proof paradox is also connected to cognitive biases. People tend to demand more evidence from opposing viewpoints than from their own. This confirmation bias leads to situations where one party feels justified in making a claim without strong evidence while expecting the other party to disprove it conclusively. This is common in ideological conflicts, where each side believes the other should bear the burden of proof. In debates about social issues, burden of proof disputes often lead to societal divisions. Consider debates about climate change. Scientists overwhelmingly agree on its existence and causes, but skeptics sometimes argue that the burden of proof lies with those claiming that human activities are responsible. This tactic creates a situation where the overwhelming scientific consensus is ignored in favor of manufactured doubt, delaying necessary action. The paradox of the burden of proof extends into the realm of artificial intelligence and decision-making algorithms. AI systems rely on data and probabilistic reasoning. Yet, when an algorithm makes an error, assigning the burden of proof becomes complex. Should the creators prove their system's reliability, or should critics prove its flaws? As AI becomes more integrated into legal, medical, and financial decisions, this paradox will become more significant. Ultimately, the paradox of the burden of proof reveals deep complexities in logic, law, philosophy, and everyday reasoning. It highlights how determining who must provide evidence is not always straightforward and can be manipulated to serve particular interests. Understanding this paradox can help individuals navigate debates more effectively and recognize when burden of proof is being unfairly shifted. In an age of misinformation, Critical thinking and awareness of this issue are more important than ever. The problem of the criterion is a fundamental issue in epistemology that deals with the difficulty of establishing a starting point for knowledge. It arises from the circular relationship between criteria for truth and the knowledge we claim to possess. This problem has been discussed extensively in philosophy, particularly concerning skepticism and the justification of beliefs. Understanding the nature of this problem reveals significant challenges in how we determine what we truly know and what justifies our claims to knowledge. At the heart of this issue lies a dilemma. To determine whether a belief is justified, we must have a criterion for distinguishing between true and false beliefs. However, before establishing such a criterion, we must already have some knowledge that allows us to determine the reliability of that criterion. This creates a circular dependency, leading to an epistemic regress that appears impossible to resolve. The problem, therefore, challenges the very foundation of human knowledge. One classical articulation of this issue comes from the ancient skeptic Sextus Empiricus. He pointed out that any attempt to justify knowledge inevitably falls into one of three problematic positions: circular reasoning, infinite regress, or dogmatism. Circular reasoning occurs when one uses a belief to justify itself. Infinite regress happens when each criterion requires another criterion, leading to an endless chain of justifications. Dogmatism arises when one simply asserts a foundational belief without justification. None of these options seem satisfactory, which gives the problem of the criterion its enduring significance. In modern philosophy, Roderick Chisholm famously explored this problem, presenting it as a central epistemological challenge. He framed the issue in terms of two interdependent questions. What do we know? And how do we know it? The challenge is that answering one question requires answering the other first, but doing so is impossible without assuming some prior knowledge or criterion. This dilemma forces philosophers to choose between foundationalism, coherentism, and skepticism as potential responses. Foundationalism seeks to resolve the problem by asserting that some basic beliefs are self-evident or justified without external criteria. These foundational beliefs serve as the bedrock upon which all other knowledge is built. However, critics argue that claiming certain beliefs as self-evident or axiomatic is an arbitrary move that fails to resolve the circularity at the core of the problem. Coherentism, on the other hand, attempts to escape the issue by arguing that justification comes from the coherence of a belief system rather than an external criterion. In this view, knowledge is justified when it fits within a web of mutually supporting beliefs. However, critics point out that a system of beliefs can be internally coherent while still being entirely detached from reality. This raises the concern that coherentism merely replaces one form of circularity with another. Skepticism, the most radical response, embraces the problem of the criterion as evidence that true knowledge is unattainable. Skeptics argue that because we cannot establish a non-circular, non-arbitrary criterion for knowledge, we must suspend judgment about what we claim to know. This position, however, is often criticized for being impractical, as it seems to undermine our ability to function in everyday life. If we cannot claim to know anything, how can we make decisions or trust our perceptions? The implications of the problem of the criterion extend beyond philosophy into various fields, including science, law, and artificial intelligence. In science, establishing criteria for what counts as valid evidence is crucial. Scientific methods rely on empirical observation and logical reasoning, but the justification of these methods often leads back to the same epistemological concerns. Why should empirical evidence be considered the best criterion for truth? This question echoes the fundamental problem at the core of epistemology. In law, the problem surfaces in determining standards of proof and evidence. How do we decide what constitutes credible testimony or valid evidence? Legal systems rely on established rules and precedents, but these rules themselves require justification. Different legal traditions adopt different criteria, demonstrating the inherent subjectivity in determining what counts as knowledge in a legal context. Artificial intelligence and machine learning also face a version of the problem of the criterion. Artificial intelligence systems are trained using datasets that serve as criteria for classification and decision-making. However, the selection of these datasets and the algorithms used to process them must be justified. How do we determine that an AI's decision-making process is valid? If an AI's outputs are based on biased or incomplete data, its knowledge may be fundamentally flawed, highlighting the importance of the criteria we establish for machine learning models. Despite its complexity, the problem of the criterion is not merely an abstract philosophical puzzle. It has real-world consequences for how we justify beliefs, make decisions, and evaluate information. In an age where misinformation is widespread, understanding the foundations of knowledge is more critical than ever. Without clear criteria for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, individuals and societies risk being misled by unreliable sources and deceptive reasoning. A potential way forward in addressing this problem is to adopt a pragmatic approach. Rather than seeking absolute certainty, some philosophers suggest that we can justify knowledge based on its practical success. If a belief consistently leads to successful predictions and effective actions, it can be considered provisionally justified. While this does not solve the problem entirely, it offers a functional way to navigate uncertainty. Ultimately, the problem of the criterion remains one of the most profound challenges in epistemology. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and question the foundations of our beliefs. While various philosophical approaches attempt to address it, none provide a definitive resolution. Recognizing this problem helps cultivate intellectual humility, encouraging a thoughtful and critical approach to knowledge in all aspects of life.